When Martha Keene stood at the train depot watching her mail-order husband ride away after just 1 week, calling her land not worth a man's future, the whole town of Whitlock knew she was finished. A widow, alone, drowning in debt. What chance did she have? But when a second stranger arrived months later, so thin the wind might blow him away, something shifted in the dust. Sometimes salvation doesn't come in the package you expect. Sometimes it comes skeletal, hollow-eyed, and stubborn as the prairie itself. Stay with me until the end of this journey and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Martha's story travels across this world. The Dakota Territory didn't forgive weakness. It tested every soul who dared plant roots in its unforgiving soil. And in the autumn of 1881, it was testing Martha Keene harder than most. She stood at the edge of her property, boots sinking into dirt that had once been rich and black, but now crumbled like ash between her fingers. 3 years. 3 years since the fever had swept through Whitlock like an invisible reaper, taking her husband James in less than a week. 3 years since she'd become that poor widow woman in everyone's whispered conversations. 3 years of watching her neighbor's eyes slide away from hers in pity, in doubt, in the quiet certainty that she wouldn't last another season. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dying grass and distant rain that never seemed to arrive. Martha pulled her shawl tighter, the same threadbare shawl she'd worn to James's funeral, the same one she'd clutched during the banker's visit last month when Mr. Thornwood had sat in her kitchen, his fingers drumming on paperwork that might as well have been her death sentence. "Mrs. Keene," he'd said, his voice performing sympathy while his eyes calculated profit, "I understand your situation. But the bank can't extend credit indefinitely, without a reliable income, without help to work the land properly." He'd trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Without a man, he'd meant. Without a husband. She'd shown him out with her head high and her hand steady, but the moment his carriage disappeared down the road, she'd gripped the edge of her kitchen table until her knuckles turned white, fighting back the scream that wanted to tear from her throat. That night, by the guttering light of her last good lamp, she'd already sold the others. Martha had done something that felt like both surrender and rebellion. She'd written a letter, not a prayer, not a plea to family who'd long since written her off as James's foolish choice. No, she'd written an advertisement for a mail-order husband. The words had come harder than plowing frozen ground. How did you sell yourself? How did you make a failing farm sound like opportunity? How did you admit you needed help without sounding desperate, even though desperation was the weight she carried in every step? Widow, 29, seeks partnership. 160 acres in Dakota Territory, hard worker, looking for same, must be willing to build, not just take. Reply to Martha Keene, Whitlock. She'd stared at those words for an hour, the pen trembling in her fingers. Partnership. Not romance, not love. She'd had love with James, sweet, simple, real. What she needed now was survival. The next morning, she'd posted the letter with the last of her spare coins, walking back through town with her spine straight despite every eye that followed her. Let them watch, let them whisper. She was done apologizing for wanting to live. Weeks crawled by like wounded animals. November turned the prairie into a study in brown and gray, the sky pressing down heavy enough to crush hope. Martha worked until her hands bled, until her back screamed, until exhaustion pulled her under each night like drowning. She repaired fences that blew down in the constant wind. She nursed the 3 remaining chickens that hadn't succumbed to a fox. She stood in the barn James had built and tried not to hear the echo of his laughter in the rafters. The letters started arriving in mid-December. The first was from a man in Missouri who wanted to know exactly how much money she had in the bank. The second was barely literate, smelling of whiskey even through the paper. The third was from a widower with 5 children who needed a mother more than a partner. Martha burned them all in the stove, watching her hopes curl into ash. Then came Robert Finch's letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost painted the windows like lace. The postmaster, old Gerald Hutchins, had handed it to her with raised eyebrows that she'd ignored. She'd waited until she was home, door closed, before opening it. The paper was fine quality, the handwriting confident and clear. "Mrs. Keene, I received your advertisement with interest. I am a man of 35 years, experienced in farming and livestock management. I have capital to invest in a promising operation and the strength to make the most of good land. I believe in building something that lasts, in creating profit through hard work and smart decisions. I am prepared to come to Whitlock to assess the situation, and if we find ourselves compatible, to enter into a marriage of partnership as you described. I require a woman who understands that success takes sacrifice and discipline. In return, I offer security, capability, and a future. Respectfully, Robert Finch. Martha had read it 3 times, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't romance, but it was solid, real, a man who talked about building, about futures, about work. She'd written back that same day, her response careful and measured. Yes, she was interested. Yes, he could come assess the property. Yes, they could discuss terms. She didn't let herself hope. Not yet. But for the first time in months, the suffocating weight on her chest lifted just enough to breathe. Robert Finch arrived on a cold January morning when the sky hung low and gray, threatening snow that wouldn't come. Martha stood on the depot platform in her best dress, a faded blue calico that James had loved, carefully mended and pressed. She'd arranged her dark hair as neatly as she could, pinned under a bonnet that had seen better days. Her hands, no matter how much she'd scrubbed them, still bore the calluses and small scars of farm work. The train's whistle split the air, and her stomach clenched tight. She wasn't alone on the platform. Half of Whitlock had found reasons to be there, watching. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shopping basket, whispering to Mrs. Crawford. The Brennan brothers leaned against a post, making no secret of their curiosity. Even Reverend Stone had materialized, his expression carefully neutral. "Let them watch," Martha told herself again. "Let them see." The train shuddered to a stop, steam billowing. Doors opened. Passengers emerged. A family with squalling children. A traveling salesman with his cases. An elderly woman helped down by the conductor. Then Robert Finch stepped onto the platform, and something in Martha's chest went very still. He was exactly what she'd hoped for. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of a man who knew his own worth. His coat was good quality, his boots polished despite the journey. His face was angular and handsome in a stern way, clean-shaven, with dark hair visible beneath his hat. When his eyes swept the platform and found her, they were intelligent, assessing. He approached with steady strides. "Mrs. Keene?" "Mr. Finch." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Welcome to Whitlock." He removed his hat, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his expression that might have been approval. "The pleasure is mine. You match your description." It wasn't poetry, but it was acknowledgement. She'd take it. "I have a wagon waiting," she said. "The farm is about 4 miles out." "Lead the way." The ride was mostly silent, filled with the creak of wagon wheels and the sound of horses' breath in cold air. Martha was acutely aware of Robert beside her, his posture straight, his eyes moving constantly across the landscape, evaluating, always evaluating. "The soil looks depleted," he said finally. Martha's hands tightened on the reins. "It's been a hard few years. The drought ends. Good management continues." His tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. "Tell me about your livestock." She told him. 3 chickens, 1 milk cow, a plow horse getting old. She didn't dress it up, didn't make excuses. These were the facts. "And debts?" Her throat went tight. "Some." "How much?" The number felt like stones in her mouth. When she said it, Robert was quiet for a long moment. "That's manageable," he said finally, and something in Martha's chest unclenched slightly. "With proper investment and work." The farm appeared over the rise, and Martha tried to see it through his eyes. The house needed paint, the barn needed repairs, the fences were patched more than original, but the bones were good. James had built well. "It's not much," she started. "It's enough to work with," Robert interrupted, already climbing down from the wagon. That first day set the pattern for the week that followed. Robert examined everything with the eye of a man calculating costs and returns. He walked the property lines, checked the well, inspected the barn's foundation. He asked questions about yield, about weather patterns, about the soil composition. He never asked about James. He never asked about her. At night he slept in the barn, propriety maintained, while Martha lay awake in the house listening to the wind and wondering if this was really happening. Wondering if salvation was really this cold, this clinical. The neighbors came calling, of course. Mrs. Henderson brought a pie with questions baked in. "Such a fine-looking man, Martha. You must be so pleased." Martha had smiled and said nothing. The Brennan brothers stopped by to help with a fence that didn't need help, their real purpose to size up Robert. He'd been polite but distant, deflecting their attempts at conversation with short answers and meaningful silence. "Proud sort, isn't he?" Tom Brennan had muttered to Martha afterward. Confident, she'd corrected, but doubt had already started creeping in like cold through cracks. It was the fourth day when things shifted. Robert was in the barn, and Martha was preparing supper. Nothing fancy, just beef stew with what vegetables she had left, when he came in holding her ledger. "You've been keeping records," he said. It wasn't a question. "James taught me. He said a farm needs accounting same as any business." Robert flipped through pages, his expression unreadable. "Your expenditures are too high." Martha's back straightened. "I buy what I need. You buy what you want." He set the ledger down with deliberate care. "Feed costs here. You could get better prices if you bought in bulk. Equipment repairs. You're paying for labor you could do yourself. Even your household expenses. Mr. Finch." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "I've kept this farm running for 3 years alone. I think I understand." "You've kept it surviving," he interrupted. "Barely. There's a difference between survival and success, Mrs. Keene." The words landed like slaps. Martha felt heat rise in her face, part anger, part shame, part something she couldn't name. "I'm not criticizing," Robert continued, his tone softening slightly. "I'm assessing. If we're to make this work, we need to understand what we're working with." "We." He'd said we. That should have mattered more than it did. That night, they sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, the ledger between them like a treaty being negotiated. Robert outlined his plans: crop rotation, investment in better equipment, expanding the herd. His ideas were sound, practical, born of real experience, but he never once asked what she thought. He presented, he explained, he decided. Martha listened, nodding in the right places, speaking when spoken to. This was partnership, she told herself. This was what she'd asked for. Then why did it feel like drowning? The 6th day, Robert went into town alone. "Business to conduct," he'd said vaguely. Martha had stayed behind, working in the cold garden, trying to coax life from frozen ground. When he returned that evening, his expression was thoughtful, distant. "I met with Mr. Thornwood at the bank," he said over supper. Martha's spoon froze halfway to her mouth. "You did what?" "I wanted to understand the full financial situation. He was quite forthcoming about your debts." Robert cut his meat with precise movements. "Also about the property values in the area." "You had no right," Martha started, but he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "This land, properly developed, could be worth considerably more. The location is good, the acreage adequate. With capital investment and modern techniques." He trailed off, his eyes distant with calculations. Something cold settled in Martha's stomach. "That's what this is about? Property value?" "It's about potential." He looked at her directly then, and his eyes were kind but firm. "You've done remarkable work keeping this place running, Mrs. Keene, truly. But you must see that a woman alone can only do so much. With my backing, with proper management, this could become something significant." "I didn't ask for backing," Martha said quietly. "I asked for partnership." "And you'll have it. As my wife, you'll share in the profits." "As your wife." The words tasted like ashes. "Not as a partner." Robert set down his fork, regarding her with the patience one might show a confused child. "Mrs. Keene, Martha, let's be practical. The law is the law. When we marry, the property becomes mine to manage. That's simply how these things work. But I assure you, I have every intention of—" "Getting out," Martha interrupted. "You have every intention of getting out of this arrangement, don't you?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I wouldn't put it quite so harshly. I simply, after seeing the full situation, the actual state of affairs, he paused, choosing words carefully. This isn't what I expected. The debts are deeper, the property more deteriorated. To make this work would require more capital, more time, more effort than I initially calculated. More than I'm worth, you mean? That's not... He stopped, started again. You're a strong woman, Martha. Admirable, truly. But strength alone doesn't pay debts, or repair buildings, or turn failed soil into profit. This land needs more than determination. It needs resources I'm not willing to commit to this particular venture. Venture. He'd called her life, her home, her last hope a venture. Martha stood slowly, her chair scraping loud in the quiet kitchen. When are you leaving? Robert had the decency to look ashamed. Tomorrow morning's train. I'm sorry, I truly am. You deserve better than this situation. I deserve honesty, Martha said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Which you couldn't give me until you'd gotten what you needed. Your assessment, your evaluation, your calculations. She walked to the door, opened it to the cold night air. The barn is available for one more night, Mr. Finch. I expect you gone at first light. He left the next morning as promised, riding the same train that had brought him, taking Martha's last hope with him into the dawn. She didn't go to the depot, didn't stand and wave, didn't give the town the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she stood in her kitchen, staring at the ledger he'd left on the table, filled with his notes and calculations and cold, practical assessments of everything she'd bled for. Mrs. Henderson came by that afternoon, pieless this time, her sympathy as suffocating as smoke. Oh, Martha, dear, we heard. What a terrible man, leading you on like that. But perhaps it's for the best? Perhaps. Thank you for coming, Martha had said, ushering her firmly toward the door. But I have work to do. The whispers started immediately. Poor Martha Keene, rejected twice now, first by death, then by sense. What man would want a failing farm and a desperate widow? How long before she had to sell, to give up, to admit defeat? Martha heard them all. The knowing looks in town, the pitying smiles, the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She felt their judgment like weight on her shoulders, pressing her down into the unforgiving earth. But she didn't break. Not yet. February came in brutal, wind cutting like knives across the prairie. Martha worked until her hands cracked and bled, until exhaustion became a constant companion. She fixed what she could, held together what she couldn't, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The bank letter arrived on a Thursday, Mr. Mammounts. Thornwood's regrets, delivered in careful legal language. They needed payment. They needed assurance. They needed her to prove she could make this work. They needed the impossible. That night, Martha sat at her table with pen and paper, the lamp burning low, and faced a choice. Give up, sell the land James had died trying to keep, admit that everyone had been right, or try one more time. Her hand shook as she began to write. She didn't advertise this time, didn't broadcast her desperation to the world. Instead, she wrote to the one respondent she'd discarded months ago, a letter so brief and plain she'd almost thrown it away. From a man named Eli Turner who'd written just a few lines. I don't have much. No land, no capital, no grand promises, but I'm honest, I work hard, and I know how to stay when things get difficult. If that's enough, I'll come. She'd rejected it then, looking for something more substantial. Now, with nothing left to lose, those simple words felt like the only honest thing in a world of calculations and assessments. Martha wrote back. Short, direct, desperate. Mr. Turner, if your offer still stands, I need help. The situation is dire. The work is hard. The future is uncertain. But if you meant what you said about staying, then come. Martha Keene. She posted it the next morning before she could change her mind, before fear could paralyze her again. Then she waited. Days became weeks. February melted into March, the snow giving way to mud that sucked at her boots and made every step an effort. Martha worked mechanically, going through the motions of survival. Feed the animals, mend the fence, haul water, sleep, repeat. She stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary, stopped meeting eyes, stopped hoping, The reply came on a Tuesday morning, thin envelope addressed in that same plain handwriting. Mrs. Keene, I'm coming. Should arrive March 24th. Eli Turner. That was all. No questions, no conditions, no calculations of cost and benefit. Just, I'm coming. Martha read it 3 times. Her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. It wasn't hope, not quite, but it was something. Maybe just curiosity about what kind of fool would agree to this disaster. March 24th arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that made you forget the sun had ever existed. Martha stood on the depot platform again, but this time she was alone. No curious neighbors, no watchful town. She'd told no one, prepared nothing. If this was to be another humiliation, she'd face it privately. The train arrived late, wheezing to a stop like an exhausted beast. Martha watched passengers disembark with a strange detachment. A couple with bundled children, a businessman with leather cases, a farmer she recognized vaguely. Then a figure emerged that made her breath catch. Not from hope, but from shock. Eli Turner was thin. Not just lean, but genuinely skeletal, his coat hanging on a frame that looked like hard times had whittled it to the bone. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that looked too large and dark in his pale face. He moved stiffly, like someone carrying invisible injuries, clutching a single battered bag. For a moment, Martha couldn't move. This was what she'd gotten? This man who looked like a strong wind might blow him back onto the train? Then his eyes found hers across the platform, and something in them stopped her spiraling thoughts. They were exhausted, yes. Wary, certainly, but steady, determined. The eyes of someone who'd walked through fire and somehow kept walking. He approached slowly, removing his hat. Up close, she could see the patches on his coat, the worn state of his boots, the way his hands trembled slightly. From cold or hunger or simple exhaustion, she couldn't tell. Mrs. Keene? His voice was quiet, rough-edged. Mr. Turner. She forced herself to stand straight, to not show her shock and dismay. Welcome to Whitlock. A corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but acknowledgement. Thank you for having me. I know I don't look like much. Direct, honest, unflinching. Been a hard winter, harder journey, but I'm here, and I'm ready to work. Martha studied him, this thin, worn, battered man who'd come anyway, who'd kept his word despite clearly having nothing, who stood before her with quiet dignity despite circumstances that should have broken it. The farm is 4 miles out, she said finally. I have a wagon. Lead the way, ma'am. They rode in silence, but it was different from the silence with Robert, less evaluative, more patient. Eli didn't examine the landscape with calculating eyes. He simply looked, taking it in without judgment. It's beautiful country, he said finally, his voice soft. Hard, but beautiful. Martha glanced at him, surprised. Most people just see the hardness. But most people haven't learned yet that hard and beautiful aren't opposites. He met her gaze briefly, then looked away. Hard things have their own kind of beauty. Takes going through some to see it. Something in Martha's chest loosened, just slightly. When the farm came into view, she watched his face carefully, waiting for disappointment, for calculation, for the moment he'd realize what he'd gotten into. Instead, Eli just nodded slowly. Good bones, he said. Your husband built well. It was the first time anyone had mentioned James without pity or avoidance. Martha's throat went tight. Yes, she managed. He did. Eli climbed down from the wagon carefully, like someone whose body didn't quite trust itself anymore. But once his feet hit ground, he stood straight, surveying the property with those steady eyes. Where would you like me to start? He asked simply. Not, what needs doing? Not, let me assess the situation. Just, where do you want me to start? Martha felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built to protect herself from more disappointment. The barn, she said quietly. There's a leak in the roof that needs patching before the spring rains, and you can stay there if that's acceptable. More than acceptable, ma'am. I've stayed in worse. He picked up his bag, then paused, turning back to face her fully. Mrs. Keene, I want to be clear about something. I came here because you needed help and because I gave my word. I don't have money to invest. I don't have grand plans or guarantees. All I have is my labor, my word, and my willingness to stay through whatever comes. If that's not enough, tell me now, and I'll take the next train out. No hard feelings. Martha looked at this thin, exhausted, honest man standing in her yard, offering the only things he had. Mr. Turner, she said, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. Right now, that's exactly what I need. He nodded once, something like relief crossing his features. Then let's get to work. As he walked toward the barn, bag slung over his shoulder, moving with determined purpose despite obvious exhaustion, Martha stood frozen in the yard. The sun broke through the clouds for just a moment, casting long shadows across the tired land. She didn't know if this would work. Didn't know if one thin man with nothing but determination could make any difference at all. But for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain across the prairie. Martha pulled her shawl tight and headed toward the house, her steps just slightly lighter than before. This was it then. Her last chance. A skinny stranger with tired eyes and an honest word. She'd make it enough. She had to. Because there were no more chances left, no more letters to write, no more hopes to pin on strangers at train stations. This was survival now. Raw, desperate, clinging by fingernails survival. And somehow, looking at Eli Turner's thin back disappearing into the barn, Martha thought maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. Not poetry, not promises, not grand plans, just staying, just showing up, just working one more day. It would have to be enough. The first drops of rain began falling that night, tentative at first, then building into a steady drumbeat against the roof. Martha lay in her bed listening to it, listening too for the telltale drip that meant the barn leak was worsening. In the darkness, she imagined Eli Turner trying to sleep beneath that leak, water finding him no matter where he moved. She should have felt guilty. Should have offered him the house, propriety be damned. But exhaustion had its own gravity, pulling her down into restless sleep before conscience could fully form. Morning came gray and wet, the kind of dawn that felt more like a continuation of night. Martha dressed quickly in the cold, her breath misting, and headed out to start the day's work. The chickens needed feeding, the cow needed milking, and there were a dozen other small desperations waiting for her attention. She found Eli already in the barn, soaked through, working on the roof from the inside. He'd somehow climbed into the rafters despite his thin frame and was using scraps of wood and tar paper to patch the worst of the leak. Water dripped steadily around him, and his hands shook with cold, but his movements were methodical, determined. "Mr. Turner," Martha called up, startled. "You should have waited. I would have helped." He looked down, his gaunt face shadowed in the dim light. "Daylight's precious, ma'am. Seemed foolish to waste it sleeping under a leak I could fix." He went back to his work, hammering a board into place with careful precision despite the trembling in his hands. Martha watched him for a long moment, something complicated happening in her chest. Robert had assessed, calculated, planned. This man had simply started working. "There's coffee in the house," she said finally, "and breakfast when you're ready." "Appreciate it, Mrs. Keene. Be down shortly." She went back to the house, put more wood in the stove, started preparing eggs and what little bacon she had left. Through the window she could see the barn, could imagine him up there in the rafters, patching holes that had defeated her for months. When Eli finally came in 20 minutes later, he was still soaked, his hair plastered to his head, but there was quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "Should hold now," he said simply, "at least through this storm." "Sit," Martha commanded, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "You'll catch your death." "Already been close enough to shake hands with death, ma'am. Figure he knows where to find me if he wants another try." But he sat, gratefully accepting the coffee she poured, wrapping his thin hands around the cup like it was the most precious thing he'd ever held. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Martha found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, the hollow of his cheeks, the way his shirt collar gaped loose around his neck, the careful way he ate as if his stomach wasn't quite sure it could trust food anymore. "When did you eat last?" she asked abruptly. Eli paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Train had some vendors, day before yesterday. Before that? His eyes met hers, and she saw him decide whether to lie. He chose truth. Weak, maybe. Work's been scarce this winter. What money I had went to getting here. Martha felt something twist in her gut. This man had spent his last resources to answer her desperate letter, to come work a failing farm for a woman who couldn't even promise him meals. "There's not much," she said quietly, "but what there is, we share, equally. You understand?" Something shifted in Eli's expression, not quite surprise, not quite relief, something deeper. "That's more than fair, Mrs. Keene." "Martha," she said impulsively, "if we're going to work together, you might as well use my given name." "Then I'm Eli." He said it carefully, like testing the weight of intimacy. "Just Eli." The rain continued through that day and the next, turning the world into a study of gray and brown. But inside the barn, inside the house, there was movement, purpose, the strange, tentative beginning of something that might become partnership. Eli worked with the single-minded focus of someone who'd learned that stopping meant thinking, and thinking led nowhere good. He repaired fence posts that had rotted through, shored up the barn's foundation, fixed the chicken coop's door that had hung crooked for months. His thin frame moved constantly, making up in determination what it lacked in strength. Martha found herself working alongside him more often than not. At first it was necessity. Many jobs required two people. But gradually she realized it was something else. His presence was quiet but steady, asking nothing, offering everything he had. On the third day, as they worked together replacing boards on the barn's exterior, Martha finally asked the question that had been building. "Where did you come from, Eli, before answering my letter?" His hand stilled on the board he was holding. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, then he spoke, his voice low and even. "East, mostly. Pennsylvania originally. Had a farm there, small operation. My wife Sarah and I—" He paused, and Martha saw his jaw tighten. "Fever took her, same one that went through here, sounds like. Took our daughter, too. Lily. She was 3. The hammer nearly slipped from Martha's hands. "Eli, I'm so—" "After that, I couldn't stay," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, as if he needed to get the words out before they choked him. "Sold everything, drifted west. Worked where I could, when I could. Learned that grief's a poor traveling companion, but a persistent one." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were ancient. "Read your letter in a boarding house in Kansas. Something about it, the honesty, I guess, the not pretending, felt like maybe here was a place I could stop running." Martha's throat had gone tight. "I lost my husband to the same fever, James, 3 years ago now." "I know," Eli said quietly. "I mean, I figured, the way you wrote about the farm, about needing partnership, not saving, you've been carrying weight, too." They stood there in the drizzle, two people who'd been hollowed out by loss, holding hammers and nails and the fragile possibility of rebuilding. "We're quite a pair," Martha said finally, trying for lightness and not quite achieving it. "Broken things sometimes fit together better," Eli replied. "Less pretense, more understanding where the cracks are." He went back to work, and after a moment, so did she. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had developed a crack of its own. The rain finally stopped on the 4th day, and the sun emerged like a blessing. The land steamed, drinking in light, and for the first time since Robert Finch had left, Martha felt something like hope. That afternoon, the Brennan brothers rode up unannounced. Tom and Jack, broad and confident, their horses well-fed and their clothes showing none of the wear that marked Martha's and Eli's existence. "Martha," Tom called out, dismounting. "Heard you had help now. Thought we'd come see." His eyes found Eli, who'd emerged from the barn, and something ugly flickered across his face. "This him?" "This is Eli Turner," Martha said firmly, stepping forward. "Eli, Tom, and Jack Brennan. They farm the next section over." Eli nodded politely. "Gentlemen," Jack Brennan circled Eli slowly, making no effort to hide his assessment. "Turner, huh? You the new husband?" "Not yet," Eli said evenly. "Right now I'm just someone helping with the work." "Helping," Tom laughed, not kindly. "Brother, no offense, but you look like a strong breeze would knock you into next week. What kind of help can you possibly be?" Martha felt anger flash hot in her chest. "The kind that shows up, the kind that works, the kind that stays," Eli interrupted quietly, his voice calm but his eyes steady on Tom's. "Whatever else I am or aren't, I'm here. And I'll be here tomorrow. That enough answer for you?" The brothers exchanged glances. Jack's expression had shifted from amusement to something more appraising. "Gutsy for a scarecrow. We'll give you that." "Jack," Martha said, her voice low and dangerous, "if you came to help, you're welcome. If you came to mock, you can leave." Tom held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, Martha. Just concerned neighbors checking in. You can't blame us for wondering. First that slick fellow from back east, now this." He gestured vaguely at Eli. "Fellow, just seems like you're having a run of bad luck with men." My luck's my business," Martha said flatly. "Until it affects the rest of us," Tom countered, his tone shifting harder. "You fail. This land goes to the bank. Bank parcels it out to whoever bids. That affects property values, affects everyone. So yeah, Martha, your luck becomes our business." The words hung in the air like a threat. Martha's hands curled into fists at her sides. Eli spoke before she could. "Seems to me your property values are your concern, and Mrs. Keene's farm is hers. If you're worried about her failing, you could help. If you're worried about your own interests, you could leave. But standing here questioning her choices on her land strikes me as neither helpful nor neighborly." The silence that followed was taut as wire. Tom Brennan's face had gone red, and Jack's hand had moved unconsciously toward his belt. For a moment, Martha thought violence might actually erupt in her yard. Then Tom laughed, sharp and bitter. "You got yourself a mouthy one, Martha. Hope he works better than he talks." He remounted his horse in one smooth motion. "Good luck. You're going to need it." The brothers rode off, and Martha let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. When she looked at Eli, he was standing very still, his thin frame rigid. "I shouldn't have spoken," he said quietly. "Not my place to—" "You should have," Martha interrupted. "Someone should have told them off months ago. Years, maybe." She managed a weak smile. "Though you just made enemies, I'm afraid." "Had worse." He turned back toward the barn, then paused. "For what it's worth, Martha, I meant it. I'm staying. However long it takes, however hard it gets. I made you a promise, and I keep my promises." "Even when the situation's worse than you expected?" He looked back at her, and his smile was sad and knowing. "The situation's always worse than expected, but so's the alternative to trying." That night, Martha cooked a real dinner, using supplies she probably couldn't afford to use, but feeling reckless with relief. Eli had stayed through the Brennan brothers' mockery, had defended her, defended them, with nothing but words and stubborn dignity. They ate together at her kitchen table, the lamp burning warm between them. Eli ate slowly, savoring every bite like prayer, and Martha found herself watching the way the light caught in his hollow cheeks, the way his hands had stopped trembling quite so badly. "Tell me about your farm," she said impulsively. "In Pennsylvania. What was it like?" Eli's fork paused. For a moment she thought she'd overstepped, pressed too hard on old wounds. Then he began to speak, his voice soft with memory. "Small, just 40 acres, but good soil. Sarah and I bought it the year we married. She was a teacher, did you know? Taught in the town school until Lily came. After that," he smiled faintly, "after that she taught Lily everything. Numbers, letters, songs. Our daughter was too young for formal schooling, but Sarah couldn't help herself." "She sounds wonderful," Martha said quietly. She was. Eli set down his fork, his eyes distant. "When the fever came, it took Lily first. 3 days. Sarah lasted a week, nursing our daughter even as the sickness took her too. I watched them die, Martha. Helpless, useless. The farm felt like a grave after that. So you left." "So I ran." His voice had gone rough. "Sold everything to the first bidder, didn't even care about the price. Just needed to be gone. Spent 2 years drifting, working odd jobs, trying to outrun memories." He looked at her then, and his eyes were raw. "Your letter found me in that boarding house in Kansas. I'd been there 3 weeks, trying to decide whether to move on or just stop. Then there were your words about partnership, about honesty, about not giving up. And I thought maybe staying somewhere, trying one more time, might be the answer. Martha's eyes burned with unshed tears. I'm glad you came. Whatever happens, I'm glad you're here. So am I, Eli said simply. They finished dinner in companionable silence, and when Eli rose to return to the barn, Martha found herself speaking before thinking. There's a spare room upstairs. It was going to be... She swallowed hard. It was going to be for children. Never got used, but it's warmer than the barn, and there's a bed. Eli froze, his hand on the door. Martha, I couldn't... You could. You should. She stood, meeting his eyes. We're partners, aren't we? Partners don't let partners freeze in barns when there are empty rooms in the house. Propriety be damned. This is survival, Eli. Let's survive it together properly. Something powerful moved across his face. Gratitude, relief, something deeper she couldn't name. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me. Just keep your word. Keep staying. Always, he said. That night, for the first time since James died, there was another person sleeping under Martha's roof. She lay in her room listening to the small sounds of someone else existing in her space, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of movement, and felt something old and frozen in her chest begin, very slowly, to thaw. The days that followed fell into rhythm. Wake before dawn, work until exhaustion, collapse into sleep, repeat. But it was different now, shared. Eli's presence changed the mathematics of survival. Where Martha would have struggled alone for hours, they completed tasks in one. Where she would have given up on repairs too complex for solo work, together they found solutions. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the farm began to respond. Fences stood straight. The barn stopped leaking. The chicken coop was secure enough that the remaining 3 chickens ventured out with something like confidence. More than that, Martha found herself responding. The suffocating loneliness that had dogged her steps began to lift. There was conversation now, not constant, not forced, but real. They talked while working, shared meals, sat together in the evenings while she mended and he carved small repairs from scrap wood. "Where'd you learn carpentry?" she asked one night, watching his thin hands shape a new handle for her broken rake. "My father," Eli said, not looking up. "He was a furniture maker before the war. Taught me everything. How to read wood grain, how to join pieces so they'd last generations. Said good work was the only honest legacy a man could leave." "He sounds wise." "He was. Died when I was 19, pneumonia." Eli held up the handle, testing its balance. "Sometimes I think about what he'd say if he could see me now. Drifting, broken, barely holding together." "I think he'd say you're still here," Martha replied quietly. "Still working, still honoring what he taught you by using it. That counts for something." Eli's hands stilled. When he looked at her, his eyes were bright. "Thank you for that." "It's true. Truth's a rare gift. Thank you anyway." But not everything was peaceful. The work was brutal, the resources minimal. There were days when Martha wanted to scream at the sheer impossibility of what they were attempting. Days when Eli's thin frame shook with exhaustion, but he kept working anyway, kept pushing until she had to physically stop him. "You're going to kill yourself," she'd said one evening, finding him barely able to stand after hours of digging post holes. "I'm already dead," he'd replied, his voice hollow. "Just moving around until someone tells my body to stop." The words had hit her like fists. She'd gripped his shoulders, thin, trembling under her hands, and made him look at her. "You listen to me, Eli Turner. You are not dead. You're here. You're real. You matter. And I won't let you work yourself into the grave because you think you deserve punishment for surviving." He'd stared at her, something breaking open in his face. Then he'd nodded once, sharp, and let her help him to the house. They didn't speak of it again, but after that, Eli worked hard but not quite so recklessly, as if her words had created a small buffer between him and the darkness he carried. 2 weeks after Eli's arrival, Mr. Thornwood came calling. Martha saw his carriage approaching and felt her stomach drop. Nothing good ever came from banker visits. Eli was in the field, and she met Thornwood at the door before he could knock. "Mr. Thornwood, what brings you out?" The banker removed his hat, his expression professionally sympathetic. "Mrs. Keene, I trust you're well. I heard you have help now." Word travels fast. In small towns, it travels at the speed of concern. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in?" She had no choice. They sat in her kitchen, the same place Robert Finch had studied her ledgers with calculating eyes. Thornwood accepted coffee he didn't drink and made small talk she didn't believe before finally getting to his purpose. "The board is concerned, Mrs. Keene, about the viability of this operation. We've extended considerable patience, but patience has limits. I'm working the farm, making improvements. Surely that counts for something." "It does, but work requires results, not just effort. Come harvest, we'll need to see production. Real production. Enough to make payments to show this land can sustain itself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to false kindness. "I say this as a friend, Martha. If you can't meet obligations by autumn, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. Perhaps it would be kinder to consider selling now, on your terms, rather than waiting for forced sale." The words hit like stones. Martha forced herself to stay calm, to not show the panic clawing at her throat. "I'll make harvest. We'll make it." "We?" Thornwood raised an eyebrow. "You mean this Turner fellow? Martha, I've seen him. He's half starved and looks like consumption walking. What possible help can he be?" Before Martha could respond, the kitchen door opened. Eli stood there, muddy and sweat-stained, his thin frame rigid with tension. "I can be the kind of help that sees things through," he said quietly. "The kind that doesn't quit when circumstances get hard. The kind that honors commitments." His eyes fixed on Thornwood with unexpected steel. "Seems to me those qualities matter more than appearances." Thornwood's expression hardened. "Young man, I don't believe we've been introduced." "Eli Turner, Mrs. Keene's partner." He said it with finality, with claim. "Partner." Thornwood stood, brushing invisible dust from his coat. "How official. Do you have capital to invest in this partnership, Mr. Turner? Resources? Collateral?" "I have my labor and my word, neither of which pay banknotes." Thornwood turned back to Martha. "Think carefully, my dear. Autumn will come faster than you expect, and sentiment won't save a failing farm." He left, and Martha sagged into her chair, all the strength draining from her limbs. Eli crossed to her quickly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "Bad. We need to produce real yield by harvest, enough to make payments plus have something to sell, on land that's half dead and with resources we don't have." She laughed bitterly. "Impossible, basically." Eli pulled out a chair, sat facing her. His thin hands covered hers on the table. "Martha, look at me." When she did, his eyes were blazing with quiet intensity. "I didn't come here because I thought it would be easy. I came because you needed help and because I needed somewhere to matter. We've got 6 months. 6 months to make this land produce. 6 months to prove everyone wrong. It's impossible. So was surviving the last 3 years. So was me making it through the last 2. So was either of us being here right now, still trying." His grip tightened. "I'm not giving up. I'm not leaving. We're doing this, Martha. Together. However scared we are, however impossible it seems, we're doing it." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, hot and unchecked. "What if we fail?" "Then we fail together, having tried everything. But we don't fail because we gave up too soon." He smiled, sad and determined. "I learned something these past years. The only true failure is stopping. Everything else is just another day of trying." Martha found herself gripping his hands back, holding on like drowning. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Together. We try." "Together," Eli confirmed. They sat like that for a long moment, two broken people holding on to each other and the fragile, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, staying and trying would be enough. Outside, the spring sun continued its climb, indifferent to human struggles. The land waited, patient and unforgiving for whatever came next. And in that kitchen, two survivors made a silent promise to each other. They would see this through to whatever end it brought, not because success was guaranteed, not because the path was clear, but because they had nowhere else to go and no one else to go there with. It would have to be enough. Spring deepened into something that felt almost like promise. The land, starved for so long, drank in the irregular rain and began tentatively greening. Martha and Eli worked with the desperate focus of people who knew everything depended on the next 6 months. They started before dawn each day, when the world was still gray and quiet. Eli would emerge from his room moving carefully, his thin frame still adjusting to regular meals, and they'd share coffee in comfortable silence before heading out to face whatever the day demanded. The first major decision came on a morning when frost still glittered on the ground, despite the calendar insisting it was April. "We need to decide about planting," Martha said, spreading her father's old farming almanac across the kitchen table. "What we plant, where, how much. We can't afford mistakes." Eli leaned over the table, studying the pages with those steady, dark eyes. His finger traced the planting schedules, the crop rotations, the careful notations James had made in margins years ago. "What did your husband usually plant?" he asked. "Wheat mostly, some corn, vegetables for the house." Martha's voice caught slightly on the past tense. "But the soil's depleted. I don't know if it can support a full wheat crop anymore." "Then we rebuild it first." Eli straightened, his expression thoughtful. "My father-in-law taught me about crop rotation, about using legumes to fix nitrogen back into exhausted soil. It's slower, but it works. We plant clover and alfalfa in the worst sections, let them work through the summer. The sections that still have some life, we plant wheat but supplement with manure and what compost we can make." "That's a lot of work for uncertain reward," Martha said slowly, "and the bank wants results now, not next year." "The bank wants money. Money comes from sustainable production, not from squeezing the last life out of dying land." He met her eyes. "We do this right, Martha. Build it to last. If we're going to fail, let's fail trying to create something real, not just chasing one desperate harvest." She studied him, this man who'd arrived looking like death, who now stood in her kitchen talking about futures and sustainability with quiet conviction. Something in her chest shifted, settled. "All right," she said, "we do it your way. We rebuild." The smile that crossed his face was like sunrise. "Our way," he corrected gently. "We rebuild our way." They spent the next 3 days planning, drawing maps of the fields, calculating what seed they could afford, what they already had, what they could possibly do without. It was meticulous, exhausting work that required hope Martha wasn't sure she possessed, but Eli possessed enough for both of them. He attacked the planning with focused intensity, cross-referencing the almanac with his own memories, making careful notes in the margins. Watching him work, Martha realized he'd been educated, not just in farming, but in thinking, in problem-solving. Whatever his circumstances now, he'd come from somewhere that valued knowledge. "You went to school," she said one evening, watching him calculate seed quantities with practiced ease. He glanced up, surprised. "Some. My father believed education mattered, even for farming folk. Sent me through 8th grade, taught me more himself after." A shadow crossed his face. "Thought I'd pass it on to Lily someday." Martha reached across the table, her hand covering his before she could think better of it. "You're passing it on now, to this land, to this farm, to me, teaching me things I never knew." His hand turned under hers, gripping back. "Thank you for that," he said quietly, "for making it mean something again." They ordered seed from the mercantile on credit that made Martha's stomach clench with anxiety. Mr. Brennan, Tom and Jack's father, owner of the largest store in Whitlock, had looked at their order with raised eyebrows. "That's ambitious, Mrs. Keene. Your land can't possibly support this variety of crops in its current state." "Then it's fortunate we're improving its state," Eli had replied calmly, his tone polite but firm. Old Mr. Brennan had studied him with shrewd eyes. "You're the thin fellow staying out there. Heard about you. My boys said you've got a mouth on you." "Your boys were questioning Mrs. Keene's choices on her own land. I merely suggested they mind their own concerns." A smile had tugged at the old man's mouth. "Did you now? Well, that must have gone over well with Tom." He'd stamped their order form with more force than necessary. I'll extend credit, but understand. This comes due at harvest. No exceptions. Understood, Martha had said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Walking home with the promise of seed delivery within the week, Eli had been quiet. Finally, he'd spoken. I'm making enemies for you. The Brennan brothers, now their father taking note. You didn't need that added to everything else. I needed someone to stand with me, Martha had replied. The rest is just noise. But it wasn't just noise, and they both knew it. In a small town, reputation mattered, allies mattered, and Martha was rapidly running out of both. The seed arrived on a Thursday, and they spent an entire day organizing it, planning the planting schedule down to the hour. Eli had created a system. What to plant when, in what order, which fields to prioritize. It was beautiful in its precision, terrifying in its complexity. If we miss our windows, if the timing's wrong, Martha trailed off, staring at the neat rows of seed sacks. Then we adjust and keep going, Eli finished. But we won't miss. We'll work every daylight hour and some dark ones too. We'll make this happen. And they did. For 3 weeks they lived in the fields, up before dawn, planting until their backs screamed and their hands bled, collapsing at night too exhausted even to speak. Eli pushed himself brutally, his thin frame driven by will more than strength. More than once, Martha found him swaying on his feet, dizzy with exhaustion and hunger he wouldn't admit to. Stop, she'd command, forcing him to sit, to drink water, to rest for 10 minutes while she continued alone. We're losing light, he'd protest. We're losing you if you collapse, she'd counter. I need you functional, not martyred. Understand? He'd nod reluctantly, but his eyes would track the sun, calculating lost time, always calculating. They planted clover in the dead sections, wheat in the struggling middle fields, corn in the patches that still showed life. They hauled manure from the barn until the smell soaked into their clothes, their hair, their dreams. They built compost heaps from every scrap of organic matter they could find. They prayed to soil and sky and whatever gods listened to desperate farmers. And slowly, impossibly, things began to grow. The first green shoots appeared in early May, tiny and fragile but undeniably alive. Martha discovered them one morning while checking the wheat field and actually fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Eli found her there, kneeling in the dirt, hands pressed to the earth. He knelt beside her without a word, and together they stared at those impossible green miracles pushing through dead soil. It's working, Martha whispered. Eli, it's actually working. It's trying, he corrected gently. We're all trying. The land, us, these little shoots fighting toward sun. Now we help them succeed. The work shifted from planting to tending. They walked the fields daily, pulling weeds, checking for pests, monitoring moisture. Eli had constructed crude irrigation channels to direct what rain fell more efficiently, and they hauled supplemental water during dry spells until their shoulders ached with permanent fire. The town watched their efforts with mixed reactions. Some, like the Reverend and a few of the older farmers, offered quiet encouragement and occasional advice. Others watched with the anticipation of vultures, waiting for failure they could dissect and distribute as warning. The Brennan brothers made a point of riding past regularly, always with comments loud enough to carry. Look at that scarecrow still upright, Jack had called one afternoon. Thought the wind would have taken him by now. Give it time, Tom had replied. Man, that thin's got no staying power. He'll be gone before harvest, mark my words. Eli had continued working, not even looking up, but Martha had seen his jaw tighten, seen the way his hands gripped the hoe harder. That night, over dinner, she'd finally addressed it. They're trying to get under your skin. Don't let them. I'm not. But his voice was tight. Eli. She waited until he looked at her. You don't have to prove anything to them. Only to yourself. Only to us. I'm not trying to prove anything, he said quietly. I'm just trying to stay. That's all I know how to do anymore. Stay and work and hope it matters. It matters, Martha said firmly. Every day you're here matters. Every seed you plant, every fence you mend, every sunrise you see, it all matters. Don't let their small minds make you doubt that. Something in his face softened. How'd you get so wise? 3 years of surviving things I thought would kill me. Turns out not dying teaches you a few things about living. He smiled then, real and reaching his eyes. Guess we're both scholars of survival. Guess we are. But survival took more than determination. It took resources they didn't have, time that moved too fast, and luck that seemed perpetually absent. In mid-May, a late frost hit without warning, killing a third of their early corn. They stood in the field at dawn, surveying the blackened, wilted stalks, and for the first time since Eli's arrival, Martha felt hope crack. "We can't afford this," she said, her voice hollow. "We needed that corn. Every stalk represented money we don't have, food for winter, proof for the bank that this could work." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his thin face drawn. Then he straightened his shoulders. "So we replant what we can, move resources from the clover sections, concentrate on what's left. We adapt." "With what seed? What money? What time?" Martha heard her voice rising, felt hysteria creeping in. "We're already stretched impossibly thin. One more setback and we handle it," Eli interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "Martha, look at me." When she did, his eyes were steady, anchoring. "This isn't the thing that breaks us. Yes, it's bad. Yes, it hurts. But it's not fatal. We're still standing. The majority of our crops are fine. We still have options." "What options?" "I can take work in town. A few days a week, whatever pays. We use that money to buy what seed we need to cover immediate costs. You maintain the farm while I'm gone. It's not ideal, but it's possible." The thought of Eli leaving, even temporarily, made something in Martha's chest constrict painfully. She'd grown used to his presence, to the shared burden, to not being alone. But she pushed the feeling down, forced herself to think practically. "You're barely strong enough for farm work. Town work will kill you." "Then it kills me working, which is better than starving still." His voice was matter-of-fact. "I've done it before, Martha. Odd jobs, manual labor, whatever needs doing, I'll survive it." "I don't want you to just survive," Martha said, surprising herself with the vehemence. "I want you to live, to be here, to—" She stopped, unsure what she'd been about to say. Eli stepped closer, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "I'll be here. A few days a week in town doesn't change that. I made you a promise, remember? I stay. This is just what staying looks like sometimes." She wanted to argue, to forbid it, to find another way. But there was no other way, and they both knew it. So she nodded, swallowing around the lump in her throat. "All right, but you take care of yourself. You hear me? No working until you collapse. No skipping meals to save money. You're no good to this farm dead." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his small smile was both sad and grateful. Eli started working in town the following Monday. He'd found employment with the railroad expansion crew that was laying new tracks south of Whitlock. Brutal work that paid daily wages. He'd leave before dawn Monday and return Thursday evening, spending 3.5 days breaking his back for money that immediately went toward farm needs. Those first few days without him were harder than Martha had expected. She'd gotten used to his presence, to shared labor and shared silence. Working alone again felt like regression, like sliding backward into the isolation she'd thought she'd escaped. But she pushed through, maintaining what they'd built, tending the surviving crops with fierce dedication. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be wasted. She wouldn't prove the doubters right. When Eli returned that first Thursday, he looked worse than when he'd arrived months ago, gaunt, exhausted, moving like every muscle screamed. He'd handed her the wages without a word and headed straight for bed, collapsing fully clothed on top of the covers. Martha had stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching him sleep with something that felt dangerously like tenderness. Then she'd carefully removed his boots, covered him with a quilt, and gone back to work with tears burning behind her eyes. This became their pattern. Eli gone Monday through Thursday, working himself to death for wages that bought seed, supplies, hope. Martha holding the farm together alone, refusing to let it fail while he sacrificed himself for its survival. Then weekends together, working side by side, both pushing exhaustion to its limits and beyond. They didn't talk about how unsustainable it was, didn't acknowledge that Eli was getting thinner again, that dark circles under his eyes had become permanent, that he sometimes swayed on his feet like a strong wind might topple him. Talking about it would mean acknowledging they couldn't keep this up. An acknowledgement felt like surrender. June arrived with punishing heat that baked the earth and tested every crop. They hauled water constantly, Eli working through weekends with desperate focus, trying to make up for days away. The crops grew despite everything, the wheat heading out gold and green, the corn reaching skyward with stubborn determination, the clover spreading thick and nitrogen-rich in the dead zones. It was working. Against all odds, impossibly, it was actually working. But the cost was written in Eli's face, in the way his hands shook, in the new hollows appearing in his cheeks. He was consuming himself for this farm, burning what little reserves he had left, and Martha could only watch it happen while trying desperately to keep their shared dream alive. One Friday evening in late June, she found him collapsed in the barn. Not sleeping, not resting, collapsed. She'd dropped everything, running to him, turning him over with hands that shook. "Eli! Eli!" She patted his face, felt for pulse, panic clawing up her throat. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Sorry, just dizzy." "When did you last eat?" He blinked slowly, trying to process the question. "Tuesday? Maybe. Saved the wages. Bought nails instead. Needed nails." Martha felt fury and fear war in her chest. "You're killing yourself," she said, her voice breaking. "Eli, you're dying right in front of me and you think I want nails more than I want you alive?" "Farm needs, I need you." The words burst out before she could stop them. "The farm needs you, alive, functional, not martyred for nails, for God's sake. What good are repairs if you're dead?" He stared at her, something shifting in his exhausted eyes. "You need me." "Yes," Martha said fiercely. "Yes, I need you, you infuriating, stubborn, self-sacrificing fool. I need you here, breathing, working beside me. I need your terrible jokes and your steady hands and your refusal to give up. I need—" Her voice cracked completely. "I need to not be alone again. Please, please don't leave me alone." Eli reached up with a trembling hand, brushing tears from her cheek that she hadn't realized were falling. "I'm not leaving," he whispered. "I promised." "Then stop working yourself to death, because dying's still leaving, Eli. It's still breaking your promise." He closed his eyes, and she saw moisture leak from the corners. "I don't know how else to help. I don't have anything else to give except this body, this work. If I stop, if I slow down, we fail. You lose everything." "If you die, I lose everything that matters," Martha said, the truth of it shocking her even as she spoke. "This farm, this land, it's just earth, Eli. It's just dirt and crops and buildings. You're real. You're alive. You matter more than any of it." "Martha." "No, listen to me." She gripped his shoulders, making him meet her eyes. "From now on, you work the farm. No more town jobs. No more railroad. We'll make do with what we have, sell what we can spare, get creative with solutions. But I won't watch you destroy yourself. I can't. Do you understand?" For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay, I understand." "Promise me," she demanded. "Really promise. No more railroad." "I promise," he said quietly. "No more railroad." She helped him to the house, fed him properly for the first time in days, and watched him fall asleep at the kitchen table with his head on his arms. Looking at him, this broken, beautiful, impossibly stubborn man who'd stayed when everyone else had left, Martha felt something shift irrevocably in her chest. She'd started this needing a worker, a partner in labor. But somewhere between planting and hauling water and fighting for survival, she'd found something else entirely, someone else. And the realization was both terrifying and inevitable. She cared for Eli Turner, more than she should, more than was safe, more than she could afford to acknowledge when everything was still so precarious. But the heart, it seemed, didn't care about timing or practicality. It felt what it felt, consequences be damned. Martha covered Eli with a blanket and stood watching him sleep, memorizing the planes of his thin face, the way his hands curled even in rest. Then she turned to the window, looking out at the fields they'd planted together, the green miracle they'd coaxed from dead earth. "We're going to make it," she whispered to the darkness, to the land, to whatever was listening. "We have to. Because losing him," her voice caught, "because losing him would be worse than losing everything else combined." The night gave no answer, but somewhere in the fields wheat rustled in the wind like whispered promises, like hope growing despite impossible odds, like two broken people refusing to let the world break them further. Morning would come. Work would continue. The bank's deadline would creep closer with each passing day. But for now, in this moment, Eli was alive and sleeping safely under her roof, and Martha was no longer alone. It would have to be enough. It had to be. Because she couldn't imagine anymore what survival would look like without him. The next morning, Eli woke slowly, disoriented to find himself in the house, covered in a blanket. Martha was already up, coffee made, breakfast cooking. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking sheepish and worn. "I collapsed," he said. "Not a question." "You did." Martha didn't look up from the stove. "After not eating for days to save money for nails." "Martha, we're not discussing it." She set a plate in front of him, loaded with more food than they usually allowed themselves. "Eat. All of it. Then we're assessing where we actually are, not where we wish we were. Real numbers, real situation." He ate obediently, and afterward they sat with the ledger between them, facing facts they'd been avoiding. The wheat crop looked promising, the clover was thriving, even the damaged corn had partially recovered. If harvest came good, they might actually make their payments. Might, if nothing else went wrong, if the weather held, if prices stayed stable, if 1,000 variables aligned perfectly. "We're still gambling," Martha said quietly. "Gambling everything on one harvest." "Every farmer gambles," Eli replied. "It's the nature of the work. We plant in faith and harvest in hope. That's all we can do." "Faith and hope," Martha laughed without humor. "Funny words for people who've been this broken." "Maybe that's why they matter more," Eli said softly. "Easy to have faith when everything's fine. When you've got nothing left except faith, that's when you learn what you're really made of." Martha looked at him across the table, this man who'd arrived half dead and stayed through everything. "What are we made of, Eli?" He met her eyes steadily. "Stubbornness, scar tissue, refusal to quit." He smiled faintly. "And maybe, just maybe, something better than we thought we were." "Maybe," Martha agreed, and for the first time in months she believed it might be true. July came in like a furnace, heat shimmering off the prairie in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. The crops that had survived spring's uncertainties now faced summer's merciless test. Martha and Eli worked in the relative cool of early morning and late evening, sheltering during the brutal midday hours when even breathing felt like inhaling fire. Without the railroad work draining him, Eli began to recover. Not quickly. The damage of months couldn't be undone in weeks, but visibly. His hands stopped shaking quite so badly. Color returned to his face in uneven patches of sunburn. He moved with less of that terrible fragility that had made Martha's heart clench every time she looked at him. They fell into new rhythms, closer than before. Working side by side in the fields, they developed an unspoken language of glances and gestures. Martha would look up to find water already being offered. Eli would reach for a tool to discover she'd anticipated his need. It was partnership refined by crisis into something smoother, more instinctive. Something dangerous, because along with the easier work came easier conversation, and with conversation came laughter. Rusty at first, like machinery long unused, but increasingly natural. Eli had a dry wit that caught Martha by surprise, deadpan observations that made her snort with unexpected laughter in the middle of exhausting work. "That chicken," he said one evening, watching their scrawniest hen scratch determinedly in the dust, "has the personality of a particularly stubborn preacher. All self-righteous indignation and no substance." Martha had laughed until her sides hurt, until tears ran down her face, until Eli was grinning at her with something bright and warm in his eyes. "What?" she'd gasped finally. "Nothing. Just, you should laugh more. It suits you." The moment had stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Martha had cleared her throat, looked away, and the moment passed. But there were more moments, small ones that accumulated like summer rain in parched earth. Eli's hand steadying her elbow when she stumbled over rough ground. Martha's fingers brushing his when passing tools, the way they'd both reach for the last biscuit, then simultaneously pull back, laughing. How Eli had started playing harmonica in the evenings, soft melodies that filled the house with something besides silence and worry. "Where'd you learn that?" Martha asked one night, mending by lamplight while music drifted through the room. "My grandfather." Eli lowered the harmonica, his expression distant and fond. He was a traveling musician before he settled down. Used to say music was the only universal language, that it could say things words couldn't. "What are you saying now?" He looked at her then, something complex moving across his face. "That I'm grateful, that this place feels like home in ways nowhere has since Pennsylvania, that I'm afraid to believe it's real." He paused. "That I'm more afraid of losing it than I am of dying." Martha's needle had stilled. "You're not losing it. We're not losing this. You can't promise that." "No," she agreed quietly. "But I can promise I'll fight like hell to keep it. And you." The last word slipped out unbidden, but she didn't take it back. Eli's eyes had gone very dark, very intense. "Martha?" A knock at the door shattered the moment. They both jumped, the spell broken. Martha opened it to find Reverend Stone on her porch, hat in hand, his weathered face concerned. "Evening, Martha. Eli. Hope I'm not intruding." "Of course not, Reverend. Come in." Martha stepped back, grateful for and resentful of the interruption in equal measure. The Reverend accepted coffee, exchanged pleasantries, then got to his purpose with the directness of a man who'd learned that kindness sometimes meant honesty. "The town's talking," he said without preamble. "About you two, about the arrangement here. I'm not here to judge. Lord knows I've seen enough to know life's more complicated than rules, but I'm here to warn you. Folks are watching, and not all kindly." "Let them watch," Eli said quietly. "We're not doing anything wrong." "I know that. You know that. But perception matters, especially for Martha. She's already fighting the bank, fighting the land, fighting circumstances. She doesn't need to fight her reputation too." Martha felt heat rise in her face, part embarrassment, part anger. "What exactly are people saying, Reverend?" "That you've got a man living in your house unmarried, that it's improper, that if the farm fails, you'll have ruined yourself for nothing." He held up a hand as she started to protest. "I'm telling you what's said, not what I believe. But Martha, you need to understand how this looks. In a town like Whitlock, appearances can destroy you faster than banknotes." "So what would you have us do?" Martha demanded. "Send Eli away when he's the only reason I have any chance of surviving? Pretend he's not here? Let propriety kill us both?" "I'd have you consider marriage," the Reverend said bluntly. "Make it legal, make it proper. You're already partners in work. Make it official in law and before God. It would silence the gossips and protect you both." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha couldn't look at Eli, could feel him rigid beside her. Marriage. The word hung between them like a loaded gun. "That's a mercenary suggestion, Reverend," Eli said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Marry for appearance's sake." "Marry for survival's sake," the Reverend corrected, "for protection, for the practical realities that govern all our lives, whether we like them or not." He looked between them with shrewd eyes. "And maybe for other reasons you're both too scared or stubborn to admit." "Reverend," Martha started. "Think about it," he interrupted gently. "That's all I ask. The bank's deadline is coming. If you fail, being married gives you both more legal protection, more options. If you succeed, you'll have done it as a unit the law recognizes. Either way, you're better off together officially than you are in this limbo that invites judgment." He stood, setting down his cup. "I'll see myself out. You two discuss it. And Martha?" He paused at the door. "That young man looks at you like you hung the moon. Just thought you should know." Then he was gone, leaving them alone with the weight of his words settling like snow. Martha couldn't meet Eli's eyes. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. Marriage, to Eli, making permanent this thing that had started as desperate convenience and become something she couldn't name. He's right about the practical aspects, Eli said quietly, his voice carefully even. About the legal protections, the silencing of gossip. It would make things simpler in many ways. Is that what you want? Martha forced herself to look at him. Marriage for simplicity's sake? His dark eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. I want whatever keeps you safe, keeps us safe, keeps this farm alive. If marriage does that, then yes, that's what I want. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't romance, but something in Martha's chest cracked open anyway, because it was honest. It was real. It was Eli, practical, protective, giving her choice even as he offered himself. And if it were about more than practicality, the words escaped before she could trap them. Would you still want it? Eli went very still. Martha, don't ask me that unless you want the truth. I want the truth. He stood slowly, crossing to where she sat, kneeling in front of her so they were eye level. His thin hands took hers carefully, like handling something precious and fragile. The truth is, I came here looking for a place to stop running, and I found a reason to start living again. The truth is, you're the first thing that's made sense in 2 years of nothing making sense. The truth is, when you told me not to leave you alone, something in me that had been dead started breathing again. His grip tightened. The truth is, I'd marry you tomorrow for practical reasons and spend the rest of my life grateful for whatever other reasons grew from it. Martha's eyes were burning, her throat tight with emotions she'd kept locked down for so long, she'd forgotten what feeling them was like. The truth is, I'm terrified, she whispered. James died, and I thought I was done with loving people who could leave, done with risking that kind of hurt again. I know, me too. Eli's thumb traced circles on her hand. Sarah and Lily dying broke something in me I didn't think could be fixed. But Martha, you've been fixing it. Every day, every moment. Just by being you, by fighting, by refusing to quit. You've made me want to be whole again. I'm not fixed, Martha said, tears finally spilling. I'm still broken, still scared, still carrying James in every corner of this house. I'm not asking you to stop carrying him. He was your husband. He built this place. He's part of why you fight so hard. Eli leaned forward, his forehead resting gently against hers. I'm just asking if maybe there's room for both, for honoring what was while building what could be. Martha closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of him, the solidity, the realness. This man who'd arrived skeletal and stayed through everything, who'd worked himself to collapse and come back fighting, who'd looked at her failing farm and seen possibility, who'd looked at her and seen someone worth staying for. Yes, she breathed. Yes, there's room. Yes, I want to try. Yes to all of it. When Eli kissed her, it was gentle and careful, a question more than a claim. Martha answered it, her hands coming up to frame his face, feeling the sharp bones of his jaw, the warmth of his skin, the reality of this moment she'd been too afraid to imagine. They married 3 days later in Reverend Stone's small church, with only the Reverend and his wife as witnesses. Martha wore her faded blue calico, the same dress she'd worn waiting for Robert Finch, but this time it felt right. Eli wore his one good shirt, carefully pressed, his thin frame standing straight despite visible nervousness. The vows were simple, traditional, spoken in voices that trembled but held firm. When Eli slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple band he'd bought with money he couldn't afford to spend, Martha felt the weight of it like an anchor, like a promise, like hope made tangible. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Stone said with a warm smile. Eli did, and Martha tasted salt from tears she hadn't realized were falling. Whether they were happy tears or scared tears or some impossible mixture of both, she couldn't say, only that they felt like release. Walking back to the farm as husband and wife, hands linked, Martha felt the world shift around them. Nothing had changed, the crop still needed tending, the bank still waited with its deadline, the future was still desperately uncertain, but everything had changed too, in ways subtle and profound. Nervous? Eli asked quietly. Terrified, Martha admitted. You? Absolutely. He squeezed her hand, but less terrified than I was of losing you. That night, they moved Eli's few belongings from the spare room to Martha's, to their room. It was awkward and strange and frighteningly intimate, this sharing of space that had been hers alone for 3 years. But when Eli held her in the darkness, when his thin arms wrapped around her and his breath was warm against her hair, Martha felt something she'd thought was dead forever. She felt safe, protected, not alone. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For staying, for fighting, for making me believe we could survive this." "We're more than surviving," Eli murmured, his voice drowsy and content. "We're living, Martha. Actually living. That's worth everything." She fell asleep listening to his heartbeat, steady and real against her ear, and for the first time in 3 years slept without nightmares of loss and failure. But reality, as always, waited for morning. The heat intensified through July, each day hotter than the last. The crops struggled, wilting under a relentless sun. Eli and Martha hauled water until their backs screamed, until their hands were raw with rope burns, until exhaustion became a permanent state of being. The wheat hung heavy now, almost ready for harvest. The corn stood tall, ears forming. Even the damaged sections showed improvement, the clover spreading thick and healthy. They were so close, impossibly close, to pulling off the miracle they'd been working toward. Then the clouds came. They appeared on a Saturday afternoon in early August, building on the western horizon like mountains. Dark, ominous, moving fast. Eli saw them first, his face going pale. "Martha, storm coming, big one." She looked up from weeding, saw the clouds, and felt her stomach drop. They'd survived frost, heat, exhaustion. But a hailstorm now, with crops almost ready for harvest, would destroy everything. "We need to do something," she said, hearing panic edge into her voice. "Cover what we can. Protect—" "There's nothing to cover with," Eli interrupted, his voice tight with the same panic she felt. "And nowhere to protect acres of crops from weather. Martha, all we can do is wait and pray." The wind picked up, cold despite the day's heat. The clouds advanced like an army, swallowing the sky. Martha and Eli stood in their yard, watching doom approach, holding hands so tightly their bones ground together. "After everything," Martha whispered, "after everything we've done, fought for, survived, it can't end like this. It can't." "Maybe it won't," Eli said, but he didn't sound convinced. The storm hit with apocalyptic fury, wind that screamed and tore, lightning that split the sky like God's judgment, rain that came in sheets so thick breathing felt like drowning. They'd secured the animals, battened down everything they could, and now could only watch from the house as nature demonstrated its power over human effort. Thunder shook the walls. Lightning illuminated the world in stark flashes that showed crops being flattened, beaten, destroyed. Martha watched through the window with tears streaming down her face, watching 6 months of work, all their hopes, being torn apart. "We have to try," she said suddenly, moving toward the door. "The wheat, if we can save any of it—" Eli grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, Martha, no, you'll be killed out there. Better dead than watching everything die." She was screaming now, hysteria taking over. "We're so close, Eli. We're right there. We can't just—" He pulled her against him, wrapping his thin arms around her as she fought and sobbed and raged against the unfairness of it all. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I know, love. I know. But losing you won't save the crops, and you matter more than any of it. Do you hear me? You matter more." Martha collapsed against him, her strength finally breaking. They sank to the floor together, holding each other while the storm raged and destroyed everything they'd built. It lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of wind and rain and lightning and the terrible sounds of destruction. When it finally passed, moving east with the same terrible speed it had arrived, the silence that followed felt obscene. They went out at first light. Martha's hands were shaking so badly she could barely walk, but she forced herself forward, forced herself to look at what the storm had done. The damage was catastrophic, but not total. The wheat field was badly beaten, maybe a third of it destroyed completely. The corn had fared worse, nearly half flattened. The vegetable garden was obliterated. Fences were down. The barn had lost part of its roof, again. But some wheat still stood. Some corn remained upright. The clover fields, being lower, had survived better than expected. It wasn't everything, but it was something. "We can salvage this," Eli said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and determination. "It's not what we hoped for, but we can salvage enough. Maybe. If we work fast, if we harvest immediately before anything else can happen." Martha looked at him, at this thin, stubborn, impossibly resilient man who'd become her husband, her partner, her reason for fighting. "How are you not giving up?" "Because giving up is easy," he replied simply. "And we've been doing the hard things so long, easy feels like cheating." He took her hand, raised it to his lips. "Plus, I promised you, for better or worse, remember? This is worse, but I'm still here." She kissed him then, hard and desperate and grateful. "Then we harvest, we salvage, we fight until there's nothing left to fight with." "That's my girl," he murmured against her mouth. They worked like people possessed, harvesting damaged wheat before it could rot, saving what corn could be saved, rebuilding fences with scavenged materials. Word of the storm spread, and to Martha's shock, help arrived. Reverend Stone came with his sons, pitching in without being asked. Old Mr. Brennan sent over supplies with a gruff note that said simply, "Survive." Mrs. Henderson and several other town women showed up with food, with bandages for rope-cut hands, with quiet encouragement. Even Tom and Jack Brennan appeared, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Heard you got hit hard," Tom said, not meeting Eli's eyes. "Nobody deserves to lose everything to weather. Figure we could help with harvest if you'll have us." Eli had extended his hand without hesitation. "We'll take any help we can get. Thank you." For 3 days, the community worked Martha and Eli's farm, harvesting, hauling, salvaging. It wasn't charity. Martha insisted on paying what she could, trading labor for labor, giving what little she had. But it was help, and it meant the difference between complete failure and desperate survival. On the third evening, as the last of the salvageable wheat was brought in, Eli pulled Martha aside. His face was gray with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright. "It's not enough," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "We saved maybe 60% of the wheat, 50% of the corn. It's not going to meet the bank's expectations. We're still short." Martha felt the news land like a stone in her chest. "How short?" He told her the number, and her breath left in a rush. Short enough that Thornwood would have grounds to foreclose. Short enough that all their work, all their sacrifice, might not matter. "There has to be something," she said desperately. "Something we can sell, some way to make up the difference." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and troubled. Then he spoke, his voice careful. "There is one thing. But Martha, I don't know if you'd consider it." "What?" "Anything. Tell me." "The clover fields, they're valuable, not for harvest but for the land itself. What we did, fixing the nitrogen, rebuilding the soil, it increased the property value significantly. If we sold one section, just one, the money would more than cover what we're short." Martha stared at him. "Sell part of the farm James had died for, the land she'd fought 3 years to keep whole." "It's just an option," Eli said quickly. "We could try to negotiate with Thornwood, beg for extension, find another way." "No," Martha interrupted. "No, you're right. The land's only worth something if we're alive to work it. James would understand. He'd want us to survive, even if it meant sacrificing part to save the whole." She gripped Eli's hand hard. "We sell one section. We pay the bank. We keep fighting." He pulled her close, and she felt him trembling, with relief, with exhaustion, with emotion he couldn't quite contain. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he whispered. "No," Martha said. "We're the strongest. Together. That's the only reason any of this worked." They approached old Mr. Brennan about purchasing the section. He agreed to a fair price, not generous, but fair, and they signed papers in his office with hands that shook. The money was real, tangible, enough to meet their obligations with even a small amount left over. They paid the bank on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the final deadline. Mr. Thornwood had accepted their payment with raised eyebrows and what might have been grudging respect. "You actually did it," he said, surprised despite himself. I didn't think it possible. A lot of people didn't, Martha replied evenly. We proved them wrong. Walking out of that bank with the receipt in hand, with the farm secured for another year, Martha felt something break open in her chest. Relief, yes. Triumph, maybe. But more than that, proof. Proof that staying mattered, that fighting mattered, that two broken people could build something that survived. Eli caught her as her knees gave out, holding her up as she laughed and cried simultaneously. We did it, she gasped. We actually did it. No, he corrected, echoing her earlier words. We did it. Together. That night, they celebrated with a dinner they could barely afford. Fresh meat, real vegetables, even a bottle of wine Reverend Stone had gifted them. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, talking and laughing with the giddiness of people who'd faced impossible odds and somehow survived. What do we do now? Martha asked, as evening deepened into night. We've got the farm for another year, but that just means another year of this. Another season of fighting, of barely surviving. We keep building, Eli said simply. The clover sections will be ready to plant next spring. We'll have better soil, better yields. We learned what works, what doesn't. We're not starting from nothing anymore, Martha. We're starting from experience, from survival, from knowing we can do the impossible when we do it together. She looked at him across the table, this man who'd arrived half dead and become her reason for living. I love you, she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. I didn't plan to, didn't want to, but I do. I love you, Eli Turner. His eyes went bright, his thin face transforming with emotion. I love you too. Have for months, probably. Kept telling myself it was gratitude, necessity, convenience. But it's love, deep and real and terrifying. Terrifying, Martha agreed. Worth it, though, Eli added. Worth everything, Martha confirmed. They went to bed that night not as desperate partners clinging to survival, but as husband and wife who'd fought through hell and found each other on the other side. When Eli held her, when they came together in the darkness with tenderness and need and love, it felt like the first real beginning either had known in years. Like maybe all the breaking had been necessary to become people who could build something this strong. Like maybe surviving was just the first step toward actually living. Autumn arrived with the kind of golden light that made even hard-won survival look beautiful. The remaining fields ripened into shades of amber and bronze, the damaged sections already showing new growth from the clover they'd planted. Martha and Eli worked the harvest with careful efficiency, each stalk of wheat precious, each ear of corn representing not just food or money, but proof that they'd done what everyone said was impossible. The morning after they finished bringing in the last of the harvest, Martha woke to find Eli already gone from their bed. She found him standing in the empty wheat field, his thin frame silhouetted against the rising sun, just standing there with his hands in his pockets. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, coming up beside him. He didn't startle, just reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Looking at what we did, what we survived, trying to make it feel real." Martha understood. The exhaustion, the constant crisis, the fight for survival had been so all-consuming that now, standing in the quiet aftermath, it felt almost dreamlike. "Does it feel real yet?" Getting there. He turned to face her, and in the morning light she could see how much he'd changed. Still thin, probably always would be, but there was color in his face now, strength in his movements, life in his eyes that had been absent when he'd first arrived. "You know what I realized this morning?" "What?" "I'm not running anymore. For the first time in 2 years, I'm not looking at the horizon planning my next escape. I'm looking at this field thinking about what we'll plant in spring, about next year and the year after, about staying." Martha's throat went tight. "Eli, I love you," he said simply. "I loved you before we married, but I think I was still holding part of myself back, still afraid to believe this was real, that you were real, that I deserved any of it. But Martha, standing here now, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm all in. Whatever comes, good, bad, impossible, I'm here. I'm yours. I'm home." She pulled him down and kissed him, tasting salt from tears, his or hers, she couldn't tell. "You are home," she whispered against his mouth. We both are. Finally. They stood there together as the sun climbed higher, two people who'd been broken apart by loss and put back together by staying. The land stretched around them, scarred but alive, like them, damaged but growing. Proof that survival wasn't pretty, but it was possible. The town's attitude toward them had shifted subtly but unmistakably. Where before there had been pity and doubt, now there was something like respect. They'd done what was considered impossible, kept a failing farm alive through determination and partnership. Word spread, as it always did in small towns, and the story took on mythic proportions with each retelling. Heard you two brought in near a full harvest despite the storm, old Mr. Brennan said when they came to settle accounts at his store. That's impressive work. We had help, Martha said. Couldn't have done it without the community. Community helps those who help themselves, he replied. You two did the work. We just lent hands when needed. He tallied their purchases, then did something unexpected. He knocked 10% off the total. Call it a wedding gift. Late, but heartfelt. Even Tom and Jack Brennan had undergone a transformation. They still weren't friendly exactly, but the open mockery had ceased. Tom had actually nodded respectfully when passing Eli on the street the previous week, and Jack had stopped by the farm once to ask advice on soil restoration. Your clover technique, Jack had said, awkward but genuine. Think it would work on our north section? Been trying to revive it for years with no luck. Eli had spent an hour explaining nitrogen fixation, crop rotation, and patience. Jack had listened intently, taking notes, and left with a handshake and an invitation to Sunday dinner that surprised them both. We're being accepted, Martha said that night, still slightly shocked. Actually accepted, not just tolerated. We earned it, Eli replied, by staying when it would have been easier to leave, by fighting when giving up made more sense. People respect that, even if they didn't expect it from us. But not everyone was pleased with their success. Mr. Thornwood, in particular, seemed to regard their survival as a personal affront. He'd been so certain they'd fail, had probably already planned how to parcel out their land. Their payment in full had clearly disrupted calculations he'd considered settled. He came calling again in mid-September, his carriage wheels crunching on the path Martha and Eli had finally managed to repair properly. Martha saw him coming and felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but Eli's hand found hers steadying. We paid, he said quietly. He's got no grounds for anything. Whatever he wants, we face it together. Thornwood accepted coffee with the same false graciousness as always, made the same empty small talk, then got to his purpose with barely concealed irritation. I've been reviewing the property records, he began, and I noticed you sold a section to Mr. Brennan. That was done without consulting the bank. Martha's back straightened. We owned the land free and clear. We had every right to sell a portion. Technically, yes, but the bank has interest in the overall value of the property as long as debts remain outstanding. Fragmenting the holdings reduces collateral value. We used the proceeds to pay you, Eli pointed out, his voice even but edged with steel, to meet our obligations ahead of deadline. That should increase the bank's confidence, not decrease it. Thornwood's eyes narrowed. Nevertheless, any future property transactions will require bank approval. I'll need both your signatures on this agreement. He produced papers, sliding them across the table. Martha scanned them quickly, her heart sinking. It was exactly what he'd said, requiring bank approval for any sale, transfer, or major alteration of the property, effectively giving them veto power over how she and Eli ran their own farm. This is overreach, Martha said flatly. We met our obligations. This punishes us for succeeding. This protects the bank's legitimate interests. Thornwood's smile was cold. You can sign it, or I can call the remaining debt due immediately. Your choice. The silence that followed was taut with rage and helplessness. They'd won, survived, succeeded, and still the banker found ways to maintain control, to keep them under his thumb. Martha felt fury building in her chest, felt words forming that would probably make everything worse. Eli spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying an authority Martha had never heard from him before. Mr. Thornwood, let me make something very clear. Mrs. Keene and I have fulfilled every obligation to your bank. We've paid on time, in full, despite circumstances that would have destroyed most operations. We've increased the property value through improvements and restoration. We've done everything right, by any reasonable measure. Young man, I'm not finished. Eli didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone made Thornwood's mouth snap shut. Now you come here demanding additional controls because we had the audacity to survive. Because we made you look foolish for betting against us. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not protecting bank interests, but punishing us for proving you wrong. Thornwood's face had gone red. How dare you? I dare because I've got nothing left to lose except my integrity, and I won't sign that away to satisfy your wounded pride. Eli stood, his thin frame rigid with dignity. You want that signature? Then restructure the debt. Lower the interest rate to something reasonable. Give us actual terms that reflect our proven ability to succeed. Otherwise, call the debt due. We'll find another way, another lender, something. But we won't sign away our autonomy to a man who's been hoping for our failure from the start. Martha stared at her husband, this man who'd arrived skeletal and voiceless, now standing up to the banker who'd terrified her for years. Pride and love swelled in her chest so powerfully she could barely breathe. Thornwood gathered his papers with shaking hands, his expression thunderous. You're making a grave mistake, both of you. Maybe, Eli agreed, but it's our mistake to make. On our land. With our lives. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. The banker left in a fury of dust and grinding wheels. The moment his carriage was out of sight, Martha's legs gave out. She sat heavily, adrenaline draining and leaving her shaking. What did we just do? She gasped. Eli, we just made an enemy of the only bank in town. We stood up for ourselves. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Martha, I know it's scary, but I'm tired of being scared, tired of letting people with power make us small. We survived the impossible. We don't have to bow to men who see us as nothing but numbers in a ledger. But the debt, we'll figure it out. Maybe find a lender in the next town. Maybe negotiate directly with Brennan for better terms. Maybe something we haven't thought of yet. His grip tightened. But I won't watch you spend the rest of your life under Thornwood's thumb, afraid and controlled. You deserve better. We deserve better. Martha looked at him, this man who'd become so much more than she'd ever imagined that first day at the depot. When did you get so brave? When I had something worth being brave for, he said simply. The fallout came swiftly. Thornwood, apparently furious at being defied, began spreading word through his network that the Keene Turner farm was a bad risk. Other merchants grew cautious about extending credit. Supplies became harder to secure on terms they could afford. But something unexpected happened. Old Mr. Brennan, hearing about the confrontation through the town's gossip network, came calling himself. Heard you told Thornwood where to stick his papers, he said without preamble, his weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. That took guts. Foolish guts, maybe, but guts nonetheless. We couldn't sign away our autonomy, Martha said, not after fighting so hard to keep the farm. Brennan nodded slowly. Respect that. Question is, what now? You need operating capital for spring, and Thornwood's made sure no one local will lend to you. We'll find a way, Eli said, though his voice held more determination than confidence. You will, because I'm offering you terms. Brennan pulled papers from his coat. I've been in farming 60 years. I know good workers from bad, know genuine effort from pretense. You two are the real thing. So here's what I propose. I buy another section of your land, but this time at a premium. You use that money to pay off Thornwood completely, clear the debt. Then you work the remaining land without anyone's boot on your neck. Martha's breath caught. Sell more land, but gain complete freedom. It was tempting, terrifyingly tempting. That would leave us with less than 100 acres. 100 acres you own free and clear, Brennan countered. 100 acres no banker can threaten. 100 acres you can build on without fear. Sometimes less is more, if it's truly yours. Martha and Eli looked at each other, communicating silently. She saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. The pain of giving up more of what James had built weighed against the freedom to move forward without constant threat. Could we talk about it? Martha asked. Just between us before deciding? Course. Take your time. Offer stands whenever you're ready. Brennan tipped his hat. For what it's worth, I think you'd be smart to take it. Freedom's worth more than acreage when you're trying to build a life. After he left, Martha and Eli sat at their kitchen table, the same table where so many crucial decisions had been made, and faced the choice before them. James built this place to be self-sufficient, Martha said quietly. Big enough to sustain a family, to grow, to last generations. Selling down to 100 acres feels like betraying that dream. Or fulfilling it differently, Eli suggested gently. James wanted you secure, wanted you to have a future. Would he care more about acreage or about you being free from debt and fear? Martha closed her eyes, thinking of James, his laugh, his dreams, his love. What would he want for her now? She knew the answer immediately, felt it with certainty that brought tears to her eyes. He'd want me to be free, she whispered. He'd want me to live, not just survive. He'd want me happy. She opened her eyes, looking at Eli. He'd want me to build a future with you, whatever that looks like. Are you sure? Martha, this is your farm, your history. I won't push you to... I'm sure. She took his hands. 100 acres that's truly ours is worth more than 200 we hold in fear. Let's do it. Let's be free. The transaction took 2 weeks to finalize. Papers signed, money exchanged, debts cleared. The day they walked out of Thornwood's bank with the final payment made and the deed free and clear felt like emerging from prison into sunlight. Thornwood had accepted the payment with barely concealed fury. You'll regret this. That land was your only real asset. Now you've got nothing. We've got everything that matters, Martha had replied evenly. We've got our freedom, our partnership, and land that's completely ours. That's more than we had before. Walking back to the farm, their farm owned outright, Martha felt lighter than she had in years. The constant weight of debt, of threat, of fear had lifted. Yes, they had less land. Yes, rebuilding would take time, but it would be rebuilding without someone's boot on their necks. What do we do now? She asked Eli as they stood surveying their 100 acres. We plant, he said simply. We rotate crops properly, rebuild soil, create something sustainable. We won't be huge, but we'll be solid. We'll grow slowly, carefully, buying back land when we can afford it, building equity year by year. He pulled her close. We build a life, Martha, not just a farm. A real life together. That winter was the first in years Martha didn't spend in constant anxiety. They'd stored enough harvest to feed themselves and the animals. They had a small amount of money set aside for emergencies. The farm was theirs, completely and legally. More than that, they had each other. Long winter evenings were spent planning spring planting, mending equipment, and simply being together. Eli played his harmonica while Martha sewed. They talked about everything, the past without flinching, the future without fear. They laughed, argued about crop placement, made love in the warm darkness of their bedroom, and slowly became not just partners in survival, but true partners in life. Tell me about Lily, Martha said one night, brave enough finally to ask about his daughter. Eli was quiet for a long moment, but when he spoke, his voice was soft with memory rather than raw with pain. She had Sarah's eyes and my stubborn streak. Could spend hours examining a single flower, asking questions I couldn't always answer. She loved stories, especially ones with dragons and brave princesses. He smiled faintly. I like to think she would have loved it here. The open sky, the animals, the wind. She would have, Martha agreed. And James would have loved you, I think. You both had that same quiet strength, that same determination to do things right. Yeah? Eli looked at her, something vulnerable in his eyes. Yeah. He'd be glad I found you. Glad I wasn't alone. Martha rested her head on his shoulder. I think they'd both want us to be happy. Really happy, not just surviving. Are you? Eli asked quietly. Happy? Martha considered the question seriously. Was she happy? After loss and struggle and desperate survival, after giving up land and dreams and the life she'd thought she'd have? Yes, she said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. Yes, I'm happy. Not in the way I thought I'd be, not the life I imagined. But Eli, when I wake up next to you, when we work the fields together, when you play harmonica in the evenings, I'm happy. It's different than with James, but it's real, It's mine. It's ours." He kissed her then, gentle and deep, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "Good. Because you've made me happier than I thought I'd ever be again. You gave me back my life when I'd given up on living. That's worth everything." Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal earth that seemed to exhale with relief. Martha and Eli began the new season with clear eyes and careful plans. They planted wheat in the best sections, rotated crops through the recovered areas, and dedicated a portion to vegetables they could preserve for winter or sell at market. The work was still hard, still demanding, but it felt different now. There was joy in it, purpose beyond mere survival. They were building something that would last, creating a legacy that was uniquely theirs. News of their complete independence spread through the community, and reactions were mixed. Some admired their courage. Others thought them foolish for giving up acreage, but most just watched with cautious interest to see what they'd do with their freedom. They did what they'd always done. They worked. But now they worked with neighbors in ways they hadn't before. Without debt hanging over them, they could afford to help others during harvest, to share equipment and knowledge. Eli's expertise with soil restoration became sought after, and he spent occasional days consulting for other farmers, bringing in small amounts of cash that helped cushion their reserves. Martha started selling preserved foods and baked goods at the town market, her products gaining reputation for quality. It wasn't much money, but it was steady, and it connected her to the community in new ways. Women who'd once pitied her now sought her advice. She was no longer that poor widow. She was Martha Turner, farmer, survivor, success story. One Saturday at market, Mrs. Henderson approached with her usual basket and uncharacteristic hesitation. "Martha, I wanted to apologize." "For what?" "For doubting you. For pitying you when you needed support. For thinking you couldn't survive without proper help." She smiled ruefully. "Turns out you had exactly the help you needed, just not in the package I expected." Martha thought of Eli, thin, poor, arriving with nothing but determination. The man everyone had dismissed who'd become her salvation. "He's pretty wonderful," she agreed simply. "You both are. You proved that what matters isn't size or strength or circumstances. It's character, commitment, the willingness to stay when it gets hard." Mrs. Henderson patted Martha's hand. "You're an inspiration, dear, to all of us who've faced impossible situations and wondered if survival was worth the fight." After she left, Martha stood in the market square, surrounded by the bustle of small-town commerce, and felt something profound settle in her chest. They'd done it. Not just survived, but succeeded. Not just endured, but transformed. They'd taken disaster and created something beautiful, something lasting, something true. That evening, she told Eli about the conversation. He listened quietly, then pulled her into his arms. "We did do it," he murmured. "But Martha, you know what I realized? The farm surviving was never the real miracle. The miracle was us. Two broken people finding each other, learning to be whole together, discovering that staying is its own kind of bravery." "When did you get so philosophical?" Martha teased, but her eyes were wet. "When I married a woman who taught me that endings aren't always the end, and that sometimes the best things grow from the hardest ground." Summer came full and golden, their crops flourishing in ways the first year's desperate planting had never achieved. The wheat stood tall and healthy, the corn reached toward endless sky, and even the vegetable garden thrived with abundance they hadn't dared hope for. The first anniversary of their marriage arrived on a Sunday in July. They marked it by walking their land together, hand in hand, surveying everything they'd built. "A year ago, I was terrified," Martha admitted. "Marrying you felt like the last desperate act of a drowning woman." "Flattering," Eli said dryly, but he was smiling. "Now it feels like the first smart decision I made after James died. Like everything else was just survival, but choosing you was living." They stopped at the cottonwood tree where James was buried, the grave Martha tended carefully, keeping it clear and marked. Eli had never shown jealousy about it, never suggested she needed to let go or move on. He understood that James was part of who she was, that honoring that past didn't diminish their present. "Thank you," Martha said quietly to the grave, to the memory, to the man who'd started her on this path, "for building this place, for loving me, for making me strong enough to survive losing you." Eli's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. They stood together in silence, past and present coexisting peacefully, and then walked back toward the house that was now truly their home. Harvest that year exceeded their best estimates. They brought in enough to feed themselves through winter with plenty left to sell. The money from the sale, combined with Martha's market earnings and Eli's consulting fees, gave them their first real financial cushion since James's death. "We could buy back a section," Eli suggested one evening, tallying their accounts. "Not much, maybe 20 acres from Brennan's purchase. But it would be a start." Martha considered it, then shook her head. "Not yet. Let's hold the money, build our cushion stronger. I want a year where we're not stretched thin, where we can breathe. Land will still be there next year, or the year after. Our security now matters more." "Look at you, being all practical and patient," Eli teased. "Learn from the best." She kissed him softly. "Besides, I'm tired of reaching for more when what we have is already so good. Let's just enjoy it for a while." They did. That winter was the warmest either had known in years, not in temperature, but in contentment. They hosted Christmas dinner for the first time, Reverend Stone and his family joining them along with old Mr. Brennan and several other neighbors. The house filled with laughter and conversation and the smell of good food, and Martha looked around her table feeling something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt joy. Pure, uncomplicated, hard-won joy. Spring came again, and with it another planting season. But this time it was routine rather than crisis, familiar rather than terrifying. They knew their land now, knew what it needed, and could provide. They planted with confidence born of experience, with hope tempered by reality, with partnership honed by surviving impossible odds together. One evening in late April, as the sun set gold and pink across their fields, Eli found Martha standing at the fence, her hand resting on her stomach with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Martha, you okay?" She turned to him, and her eyes were bright with tears and something else, something that made his heart stutter. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. "About 2 months, I think. I wasn't sure until today, wasn't ready to believe it, but Eli, I'm pregnant." He stood frozen for a heartbeat, then pulled her into his arms so fiercely she gasped. "Martha, God, Martha, are you happy about this? After everything?" Terrified, she admitted into his shoulder. "But yes, happy. So happy I can barely breathe with it. We're going to have a baby, Eli. A family. A future." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. A baby. Our baby. I never thought, after Lily, I never thought I'd get to be a father again." "You'll be wonderful," Martha said with certainty. "Patient and kind and strong. Everything a father should be." They stood together as darkness fell, holding each other and the fragile, perfect promise of new life. Around them, the land stretched quiet and alive, testimony to what determination could build. Above them, stars emerged one by one, endless and beautiful. And between them, hope bloomed like spring wheat, fragile but persistent, growing toward light. The pregnancy was healthy, and Martha worked carefully through the summer, slowing down as her body changed but refusing to stop completely. Eli fussed over her constantly, taking over the heavier work, insisting she rest more than she wanted to. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one afternoon when he'd forbidden her to lift a water bucket. "You're carrying our child," he countered. "Your precious cargo. Let me take care of you, Martha. Please." So she did, learning to accept care after years of forced self-sufficiency, learning that letting Eli help didn't make her weak, just loved. Their daughter was born on a cold November morning, arriving quickly and healthy, with powerful lungs and a determined grip. They named her Sarah James Turner, honoring both their pasts, the people who'd shaped them into who they'd become. Holding his daughter for the first time, Eli wept openly, great shaking sobs that he tried to muffle against Martha's shoulder. "She's real," he kept saying. "She's real and alive and perfect." "She's ours," Martha whispered, exhausted and exhilarated. "Our family, our future, everything we fought for." Sarah grew strong and stubborn, with her mother's determination and her father's quiet intensity. By the time spring came again, she was crawling everywhere, investigating her world with fearless curiosity. The farm rang with new sounds, baby laughter, childish babbling, the soft songs Martha sang while nursing. They bought back 20 acres that spring, then another 30 the following year. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt what they'd sold, but better, with nitrogen-rich soil, smart rotation, sustainable practices. The farm grew not just in size, but in reputation. People came from neighboring counties to see what the Turners had done, to learn Eli's techniques, to marvel at land restored from the edge of death. But more than the farm's success, people talked about the partnership, about how a widow and a stranger had found each other in desperation and built something that looked like destiny, about how staying and fighting and refusing to quit had created not just survival, but triumph. Years passed. Sarah grew into a bright, fierce girl who loved the land like her parents. They had 2 more children, a boy they named James, then another girl they called Lily. The house that had once echoed with loneliness filled with life and noise and love. On their 10th anniversary, Martha and Eli stood in the same spot where they'd surveyed their first desperate harvest. But now the land stretched green and golden around them, fully restored and thriving. The house stood proud and painted, the barn repaired and strong. Children's laughter drifted from the yard where Sarah was teaching her younger siblings to feed the chickens. "Did you ever imagine this?" Martha asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "That first day when you arrived so thin, the wind could blow you away?" "No," Eli admitted. "I came here planning to work until my body gave out, to maybe last a season before drifting again. I never imagined finding home, finding you, finding reasons to stay that went deeper than obligation." "I'm glad you stayed," Martha said softly. "I'm glad you were too stubborn to leave when it got hard. I'm glad you taught me that love doesn't always look like we expect, but that doesn't make it less real." "I'm glad you saw past the surface," Eli replied, "past the skinny man with nothing, to whatever potential was underneath. I'm glad you gave me a chance when you had every reason to give up." They stood together watching their children play, watching their land thrive, watching the sunset paint their world in gold and promise. 2 people who'd been broken by loss and rebuilt by staying. 2 people who'd learned that the strongest foundations are built on honesty, partnership, and the stubborn refusal to quit. "We did it," Martha whispered. "We did," Eli agreed. And in the fields around them, wheat rustled in the evening wind like applause, celebrating the harvest of hands and hearts that had refused to let the story end in despair. Celebrating 2 souls who'd learned that love isn't always found in the strongest bodies or most promising circumstances, but in the ones who stay through storms and drought and impossible odds, simply because staying matters. Because staying is its own form of love. Because sometimes the greatest bravery is just showing up tomorrow and choosing to try again. And in a farmhouse in Dakota Territory, surrounded by land they'd saved and children they'd made, and a life they'd built from nothing but determination, Martha and Eli Turner had proved that broken things, given time and care and stubborn hope, could become something more beautiful than anyone imagined possible. The story of the widow and the skinny stranger became legend in Whitlock, told to young couples facing their own hardships, whispered as encouragement when times got tough. And years later, when Martha and Eli were old and gray, sitting together on their porch, watching grandchildren play in fields that had once been dead, they'd look at each other and smile, because they knew the truth that others were still learning, that success isn't measured in acreage or wealth or perfection, but in staying power, in the willingness to fight for what matters, in finding someone who'll stand beside you when the world says run, and building something together that neither could have built alone. They knew, and they'd proven, that love doesn't always arrive in the expected package. Sometimes it arrives thin and hollow-eyed, with nothing to offer but a promise to stay. And sometimes that's everything. 25 years after that desperate spring when a skeletal stranger had stepped off a train into Martha's last hope, the Turner farm had become something neither of them could have imagined in those early, brutal days. The main house had been expanded twice, rooms added as children grew, and then as grandchildren began arriving. The barn Eli had first patched in a rainstorm now stood reinforced and weatherproof, housing dairy cows, horses, and equipment that represented decades of careful investment. The field stretched in orderly sections, each one part of a rotation system that had become a model for sustainable farming throughout the territory. But on this particular autumn morning, with frost glittering on the grass and the sun barely cresting the horizon, Martha stood alone in the kitchen of the house James had built and Eli had made into a home. She was 54 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her hands marked by decades of work, but still strong. Through the window she could see Eli in the distance, walking the fence line with their grandson Jacob, teaching him the same careful attention to detail he'd taught all their children. The sight made her throat tight with emotion that hadn't dulled with time. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when she heard the knock, unusual for this early hour. When she opened the door, she found a young woman standing there, perhaps 20, with a battered carpet bag and eyes that held the kind of desperation Martha recognized instantly. "Mrs. Turner?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry to bother you so early. My name is Caroline Webb. I heard about you in town, about what you and your husband did, building this place from nothing. I was hoping—" She swallowed hard. "I was hoping you might need help. I can work hard, I don't eat much. I just need somewhere safe to stay for a while." Martha saw herself in this girl, saw the pride fighting shame, the desperation masked as capability. Without hesitation, she opened the door wider. "Come in. You look frozen. There's coffee and breakfast, and then we'll talk." Over biscuits and eggs, the story came out haltingly. Caroline had been engaged to a man in town who'd proven violent. She'd fled with nothing, had nowhere to go, no family to fall back on. She'd been sleeping in the church basement for 3 days when someone had mentioned the Turner farm and the woman who'd once been in similarly desperate circumstances. "I can clean, cook, help with harvest, anything," Caroline said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was a lifeline. "I'm not asking for charity, just a chance." Martha studied her, seeing the steel beneath the fear, the determination not to be broken. She made her decision instantly. "We do need help, actually. Our daughter Sarah just had twins and could use someone at the house while she recovers. Room and board plus wages. Fair work for fair pay." "How does that sound?" Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Martha said gently. "I know you're brave enough to ask for help instead of giving up. I know you're willing to work. The rest, we'll figure out together." When Eli came in for breakfast an hour later, trailing their grandson in the scent of morning air, he took in the scene with his usual quiet perception. Martha introduced Caroline, explained the situation in brief, and watched his expression soften with understanding. "Welcome to the Turner farm," he said simply, extending his hand. "Fair warning, we work you hard here, but we take care of our own. You need anything, you speak up. No suffering in silence under this roof." Over the following weeks, Caroline integrated into the farm's rhythm. She was good with children, patient with Sarah's fussy twins, and capable in ways that spoke of harder experiences than she'd yet shared. Martha watched her slowly relax, saw the haunted look begin to fade from her eyes, and felt the peculiar satisfaction of being able to offer what had once been given to them. One evening, while helping Martha preserve the last of the season's vegetables, Caroline finally asked the question that had clearly been building. "Mrs. Turner, people in town say Mr. Turner arrived with nothing, that everyone thought you were crazy to take him in. Is that true?" Martha's hands stilled in their work, memories flooding back with surprising clarity. "True enough. He was thin as a rail, looked half dead, and everyone expected him to leave within a week, including me, maybe. But he stayed." "He stayed," Martha agreed, "through drought and storms and crisis after crisis. Stayed when leaving would have been smarter, easier, saner, and in the staying, we built all this." She gestured around them at the warm kitchen, the sound of children playing in the next room, the security that decades of partnership had created. "Did you love him right away?" Caroline asked, then flushed. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "No, it's all right." Martha considered the question seriously. "I didn't love him at first. I needed him, which is different. But love grew from the working together, from the choosing to stay when things got impossible, from learning that partnership can become something deeper when both people refuse to quit on each other." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "The man I was engaged to, he was charming at first, promised me everything. But when things got hard, when his business failed, he became someone else. Mean, violent. I thought I was supposed to stay anyway. The commitment meant enduring anything. Commitment means staying through difficulties you face together, Martha said firmly. Not staying to be someone's target when they won't face their own demons. You did the right thing leaving, the brave thing. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like failure. Martha set down her paring knife and took Caroline's hands, meeting her eyes directly. Listen to me. Leaving someone who hurts you isn't failure. Staying in a situation that destroys you isn't loyalty. Sometimes the bravest thing is recognizing what's broken and walking away. Mr. Turner and I stayed through hard things, yes, but we stayed together, facing them as partners. That's different than staying while someone tears you down. Caroline's eyes had filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered. I needed to hear that. The conversation stayed with Martha long after Caroline had gone to bed. That night, lying beside Eli in the darkness of their room, she told him about it. We've become what people think of when they think about successful partnership, she said quietly. The story everyone tells about staying and fighting and winning, but Caroline reminded me how easily our story could have gone differently. If you'd been cruel or controlling or broken in ways that hurt me instead of matching my own brokenness. We were lucky, Eli. Lucky to find each other when we did, in the ways we did. Eli pulled her closer, his thin frame still angular despite decades of better nutrition. Some things never fully changed. Luck played a part, he agreed, but so did choice. Every day we chose to work together instead of against each other, chose to communicate instead of festering, chose to see each other as partners instead of adversaries. That wasn't luck, love. That was effort. Still, I think about what my life would be if Robert Finch had stayed. If I'd been so desperate, I'd accepted whatever he offered, even if it meant becoming less than myself. But you didn't. You sent him away when he showed you who he really was. You had the strength to wait for something real, even when waiting looked like certain failure. He kissed her temple. That's why we worked, Martha. Not because we were perfect, but because we were both strong enough to demand real partnership instead of settling for less. She thought about that as she drifted towards sleep, thought about all the moments over 25 years where they could have failed, could have broken, could have become just another story of survival without joy. But they'd chosen differently, day after day, year after year, chosen to stay not just physically, but emotionally present, chosen to work not just the land, but the relationship, chosen to keep choosing each other. It was a good thought to fall asleep on. Winter arrived gently that year, snow falling soft instead of brutal, cold that nipped rather than killed. Caroline had proven herself indispensable, and somewhere around Christmas, Martha noticed the way Jacob, their eldest grandson, 19 and helping run the farm, had started finding excuses to be wherever Caroline was working. She mentioned it to Eli one evening, and he'd smiled that slow, knowing smile that still made her heart flip after all these years. History has a way of echoing, he observed. Young man who needs direction, young woman who needs safety, farm that needs both of them, familiar story. Should we say something? Let them figure it out. We did. Martha watched the young courtship unfold with the bittersweet awareness of someone who'd lived enough to know how precious and fragile such beginnings were. Jacob was good, steady like his grandfather, with Eli's quiet intensity and Martha's determination. Caroline was healing, growing stronger, beginning to laugh in ways that suggested she was remembering how. By spring, they were engaged. By summer, married in the same small church where Martha and Eli had spoken their vows a quarter-century before. The wedding was simple but joyful, the whole community turning out to celebrate, and Martha stood with Eli's arm around her waist, watching their grandson promise to love and cherish this woman who'd arrived desperate and was now choosing to stay by choice rather than necessity. "We did good," Eli murmured in her ear. "We did," Martha agreed. Not just with the farm, with showing people that staying matters, that building matters, that love can grow in the hardest soil if you're willing to tend it. The years continued their steady march. More grandchildren were born, each one a reminder that what they'd built extended far beyond property lines and crop yields. The farm remained prosperous, adapted to new techniques, survived new challenges. But more importantly, It remained a place where family gathered, where stories were told, where the history of their survival and triumph was passed down like precious inheritance. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a party that filled the house and spilled into the yard. 3 generations of Turners, plus extended family and community members whose lives had been touched by their example. There were speeches and laughter and music, Eli's harmonica joined by fiddles and guitars, dancing on grass where wheat had once struggled to grow. At sunset, Martha and Eli slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand to the cottonwood tree where James lay buried. The grave was well tended still, flowers growing wild and sweet around the marker. "Thank you," Martha said quietly, as she did every year, "for starting this, for loving me enough to build something worth fighting for making me strong enough to survive losing you and brave enough to love again." Eli stood silent beside her, his presence a comfort rather than intrusion. He'd long ago made peace with Martha's first love, understanding that the heart's capacity wasn't diminished by what it had held before, only expanded. "And thank you," Martha said, turning to her husband, "for being exactly who you were when I needed exactly that. For staying when anyone sensible would have run, for building this life with me one impossible day at a time." Eli cupped her face in his work-worn hands, his eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you for seeing past the surface to whatever was underneath, for giving a broken man a reason to be whole. For 30 years of partnership that's been the greatest privilege of my life." He kissed her softly. "I'd do it all again, Martha. Every hard moment, every crisis, every impossible challenge. All of it just to end up here with you." They walked back toward the house as darkness fell, toward the light and music and celebration of a family that existed because 2 desperate people had refused to give up. The air was warm and full of promise, carrying laughter and the sweet scent of harvest. Inside the house, their great-granddaughter, Sarah's daughter's first child, was being passed around, cooed over, welcomed into the world their struggle had created. She had Martha's dark hair and Eli's serious eyes, and holding her, Martha felt the weight of legacy settle gently on her shoulders. "This is what we did," she whispered to the baby, to Eli, to the family surrounding them. "We stayed, we fought, we built something that lasts. And now it's yours to carry forward, to protect, to pass on. Remember that when things get hard. Remember that staying matters, that choosing love matters, that refusing to quit matters." Eli's arm came around both of them, and in that moment, surrounded by the family they'd created and the community they'd helped build, Martha felt the kind of peace that only comes from a life fully lived. Not perfectly. They'd made mistakes, faced failures, weathered storms both literal and figurative, but lived with intention, with partnership, with love that had grown from the thinnest soil into something strong enough to shelter generations. The party continued late into the night, stories and laughter echoing across land that had witnessed their transformation from desperate survivors to architects of legacy. And somewhere in the darkness, the wheat fields rustled their eternal applause, celebrating not just what had been harvested, but what had been planted, seeds of hope, determination, and love that would continue growing long after the farmers who'd sown them were just memories and stories told to wide-eyed children. But for now, tonight, they were still here. Still standing, still together. 2 people who'd learned that sometimes salvation comes skeletal and desperate, that sometimes love grows from necessity into choice, and that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in what you gain, but in what you refuse to surrender. The land, the love, the stubborn, beautiful insistence on staying, always staying. The 2 HTTP says www.youtube.com/watch. B7Y4 FFC82. Here's a cinematic 5-part American-style retelling of A Mail-Order Husband Was Rejected for Being Too Skinny Until a Poor Widow Showed Her True Love, rewritten for stronger dramatic pacing and closure, with new character names, no overlap with prior CB stories. Title: The Widow and the Skinny Stranger Who Stayed Through the Storm. 1. Opening: The Widow's Letter to the Wind. Dakota Territory, 1881. The prairie lay cracked in gold beneath the dying sun when Martha Keene, a widowed farmer, pressed her hand against the earth and whispered a promise. I won't let it die. 3 years had passed since fever stole her husband, leaving her the land, the debts, and a silence so deep it swallowed her prayers. The town of Whitlock pitied her. They whispered that a woman couldn't carry a farm alone. Yet each dawn, she rose with grit in her bones and loneliness in her chest. Then one evening, by lamplight, she wrote a letter, not to love, but to endurance. A mail-order husband ad. She asked for a partner, not a savior, someone who'd work beside her through dust and storm. Weeks later, she received an answer from Robert Finch, a man who wrote of profits, acres, and strong hands. He sounded capable, grounded. She said yes. The town watched as she waited for the stagecoach, her best dress faded but her resolve bright. When Robert stepped down, broad-shouldered, confident, polished, Martha thought maybe her luck had finally changed. But before sunset fell, his gaze measured her like soil for sale. 2. Rising action. The men who wanted her land. Robert stayed a week. He walked her fields, checked her barns, and counted her livestock as if tallying inventory. Over supper, he spoke of expansion and new machinery, never once saying we. When he finally packed his bag, his words cut colder than the coming frost. You're strong, Mrs. Keene, he said, but this land needs more than a woman's will. Then he rode away, leaving tireless work and wounded pride behind. Martha buried her anger in the soil, planting through the ache. The neighbors whispered again, some cruel, some kind. She tried, they said. She'll try again. Months later, another letter arrived. This one from Eli Turner, short, plain, almost clumsy. No boasts, no promises. Just one line that made her pause. I don't have much, but I know how to stay. When the stage arrived, he stepped down thin and hollow-cheeked, his coat patched, his hands raw from travel. The town snickered. Too skinny to hold a shovel, someone muttered. But Martha saw something else. Tired eyes that had seen hard days and hadn't given up. Welcome to Whitlock, Mr. Turner, she said softly. The land's not kind, but it's honest. He tipped his hat. Ma'am, so am I. 3. Climax. Drought, dust, and the choice to stay. Winter thawed into drought, and the fields turned brittle. Together, they fought for every stalk, hauling water until their hands split. The gossip didn't stop. She hired a ghost, one man laughed. But Eli worked like one possessed, mending fences, fixing roofs, playing his harmonica at night when words ran out. One evening, under a blood-red sunset, he confessed quietly, I came west looking for a place that wouldn't give up on me first. Martha's throat caught. Then you found it. But when the sky refused rain, despair crept between them. One night, Eli sat silent on the porch, the harmonica idle in his lap. Maybe this place deserves someone stronger, he said. Martha reached across the space between them, taking his rough hand. Strength isn't loud, Eli. It's showing up tomorrow. Then came the storm, a monster of wind and lightning that clawed the sky apart. Roofs tore, fences flew, wheat flattened to mud. In the chaos, Eli's thin frame fought to secure the barn doors. Martha ran through the rain, shoulder to shoulder with him, both soaked and trembling. When it was over, they collapsed inside, drenched and shaking. I told you I'd stay, he rasped. Martha pressed her forehead to his. And so will I. 4. Resolution. A harvest of hands and hearts. The morning after the storm, the world lay broken, but not lost. Mud instead of dust, bent wheat still clinging upright. They began again. One row, one repair, one prayer. As summer burned into gold, the first harvest rose from the wreckage, thin but alive. The neighbors who had doubted her came to help thresh, drawn by the quiet miracle of survival. At the celebration that followed, lanterns swayed in the warm wind. Laughter rose for the first time in years. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, hair slicked back, his clean shirt pressed. When he held out his hand, Martha hesitated, then smiled. May I have this dance? He asked. You better, she said. They moved slowly, clumsy and real, beneath the open prairie sky. The harmonica joined the fiddle's tune, and for the first time since James's death, Martha felt her heart beat not from grief, but from joy. What mounts? 5. Breakthrough and ending. The season that stayed. The years that followed didn't come easy, but they came together. The Keene Turner farm grew stronger with each storm weathered. Eli never left. He planted alongside her, laughed at the rain, fixed what broke. When neighbors called him the skinny man who saved a widow's land, he only grinned. No, he'd say, she saved mine. Each fall, when the fields ripened gold, they'd stand hand in hand at the cottonwood where Martha's first husband lay. We did it, she'd whisper. And when the prairie wind rose, rustling the wheat like applause, it carried their laughter clear across Whitlock. Two souls who had learned that love isn't found in the strongest hands, but in the ones that never let go.